Hey dreamers, tonight, what if I told you that everything, the stars, the oceans, even the breath moving through your lungs right now, exists because of one impossible act? Before time began, there was nothing. No light, no darkness, not even emptiness as we know it. And then, something happened that shouldn't have been possible. In the sacred temples of Heliopolis, ancient Egyptian priests guarded a secret. A creation story so profound that it explains the very fabric of reality. At its center stands a god who did what no being in existence should be able to do. But here's what they never told you in history class. This isn't just ancient mythology. The forces that were set in motion at that moment, they're still at work right now, holding your world together while you listen to these words. So what was this impossible act? What did this god do that changed absolutely nothing into everything? And why does it matter to you? Thousands of years later, before you settle in, like the video and subscribe. It helps me keep making these videos every day. And let me know in the comments which is your favorite Egyptian god. Mine is certainly Horus. In the very beginning, there was only chaos. The ancient Egyptians called it none. Not a god exactly, something far more primal and strange. None was an endless, boundless ocean of formless waters, dark and heavy, swirling with infinite potential. It was neither here nor there, neither alive nor dead, simply existing as pure possibility wrapped in darkness. There were no shores to none, no bottom to its depths, no surface to break the monotony of its churning expanse. Everything that would ever become, every god, every human, every creature that breathed, lay dormant within those chaotic waters. All of it waiting for something to happen, waiting for someone with the power to imagine things into being. The none was not evil or malicious. It was simply potential itself, raw and unformed. Picture this darkness for a moment. Not the comfortable darkness of a night sky where stars pierce through, but a darkness that has never known light. A darkness that has no concept of what light even means. This is none. It is suffocating and weightless all at once. Boundless, yet somehow constraining. A paradox given form. The waters themselves held no temperature. They felt no current. They produced no sound. They simply existed in their perfect, terrible emptiness. Which is exactly where our story truly begins. Imagine floating in water that has no sensation, no up, no down, no direction at all. And then, in this vast nothingness, the ancient Egyptians called this mound the Ben-Ben. It represents that crucial moment when order begins to challenge chaos, when possibility begins to harden into form. This mound broke the surface of the primordial waters like a child's cry, breaking the silence of an empty house. It was small, almost impossibly small compared to the enormity of the none surrounding it. But it was real, it was solid, and most importantly, it was the stage upon which all of creation would unfold. The primordial mound was not created by anyone. It simply emerged. As inevitable as a sunrise, as necessary as the first heartbeat. Upon this mound, standing utterly alone, was Atum. He simply appeared. Or perhaps he had always been there, lying dormant within the potential of none itself, waiting for the exact moment he could become conscious. Waiting to become aware of his own existence. Atum is a name that means the complete one, or the accomplished one, a title suggesting wholeness and totality. But at this first moment, Atum was something quite different from complete. He was utterly, devastatingly alone. He was the only being in existence, the only consciousness in all the cosmos. He was supremely, cosmically isolated. Imagine what that loneliness must have felt like, if a god could feel such a thing. Atum stood on his small mound of earth, looking out at the endless expanse of none in every direction. There was no one to speak to, no one to acknowledge his existence, no one to share the burden of being the only conscious thing in all of creation. The silence would have been absolute, crushing. He was surrounded by infinite potential, yet utterly isolated from everything else that existed. In fact, everything else that existed was just him, only him. looking out at darkness, looking out at chaos, with no companion to ease the weight of that existence. Can you feel the weight of his solitude? This is the peculiar genius of the Egyptian creation myth. They understood that loneliness, that existential isolation, could be the catalyst for creation itself. Not anger, not duty, not some grand celestial design, but loneliness. The need for companionship drove Atum to do something no other being in the universe had ever done, or could ever do again. He created himself a family. He did it entirely alone, using only the power that dwelled within his own divine being. And in that moment, the entire universe changed forever. Now, the ancient texts describe this act of creation in language that might make modern readers shift uncomfortably. Atum created Shu and Tefnut, the god of air and the goddess of moisture, through what we might delicately call an act of self-generation. Some versions say he spat them into being, his divine saliva giving form to his children. Other versions speak of masturbation, of Atum using his own hand in an act of solitary creation that would result in two new divine beings. A few texts even suggest he created them simply through the force of his will, or through a union with his own shadow. The different versions of this creation act reveal something important about Egyptian thinking. They were comfortable with multiple versions of truth coexisting simultaneously. They understood that reality could be described in many ways, and all could be equally valid. The specifics of how he did it matter less than the profound truth the myth conveys. Atum possessed the power to create life from within himself, without needing any external force or external partner. He was self-sufficient in a way that no other god could ever be. Certainly no human could ever be. He was the origin point, the first cause, the beginning without a beginning. From his divine solitude, from his fundamental aloneness, he brought forth the first family, the first duality, the first relationship in all of existence. And in that moment, loneliness transformed into creation. Isolation became fecundity. The emptiness was filled with new life, a solution so fundamental it would echo through all eternity. Shu and Tefnut emerged into the world as something far more than just objects. They were fundamental forces, necessary elements without which existence could not continue. Shu represented air, wind, lightness, and the space between things. Tefnut represented moisture, dew, rain, and the breath of life. Together, they embodied the first pairing, the first true separation of creation into distinct entities. They could interact with one another, could relate to each other, could eventually create something greater than themselves. And in a characteristic bit of divine logic, these two gods were also brother and sister, consorts to one another. A solution to isolation that was as elegant as it was unnecessarily complicated, a signature move of divine project management. When Atum created Shu and Tefnut, he did something that would echo through all of creation. He named them. Shu he called life. Tefnut he called order. These were not arbitrary labels, but descriptions of their fundamental nature and purpose. Shu, as life and air, was the breath that animated all things, the very essence of vitality and movement. Tefnut, as order and moisture, was the organizing principle, the force that gave shape to chaos, the principle that allowed form to persist. Between these two principles, life and order, all creation would unfold. All future generations of gods would eventually emerge. All the forms of existence that would ever come to be would be built upon this foundation. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. The initial loneliness that drove Atum to create his children soon transformed into a different kind of anxiety. After bringing Shu and Tefnut into existence, Atum sent them out into the darkness of none, to explore, to understand this endless chaos that surrounded their tiny island of existence. A parent's desire to see their children discover the world is natural enough, one supposes, though even gods seem prone to making mistakes based on emotions rather than foresight. It's oddly reassuring, in a way, that even the first being in the universe occasionally let his heart override his wisdom. This pattern creation, followed by doubt, followed by reconciliation, would repeat throughout the cosmic order. Shu and Tefnut ventured out into the primordial darkness, but as time passed, Atum began to worry. Did they find their way? Were they lost in the infinite waters of none? Were they afraid? The silence of their absence grew heavier and heavier on his divine mind, until finally Atum could bear it no longer. He could not reach them with his voice, could not see them across the vastness of chaos. So he did something that would become one of the most important and consequential acts in the history of creation. He removed his own eye and sent it forth as a messenger. This eye of Atum, which would later become known as the Eye of Ra, was not merely an organ of sight, but a manifestation of divine will and divine power. It had consciousness, purpose, the authority to act on behalf of its creator. The eye searched through the nun, piercing the darkness with its luminous gaze, seeking the lost children. And eventually, after what must have seemed like an eternity, after an age of searching through infinite waters, it found them. Shu and Tefnut were brought back to their father. When Atum saw them again alive, whole, unharmed, something remarkable happened. Atum wept. The god who had created himself, who had been utterly alone with only his own thoughts for company, who had endured the silence of an uncreated cosmos, shed tears of pure joy at his children's return. And these tears were not mere water. They fell upon the mound where Atum stood. From them arose humanity itself. The ancient Egyptians believed that humans emerged from a god's tears, from the overflow of emotion that comes with reunion and relief and love. It's a beautiful image, really. The very first humans, born not from duty or calculation, but from the genuine emotional response of a creator god being reunited with those he loved. Humans born from tears of joy. That's a detail worth contemplating. Can you imagine being born from such a moment of profound love and relief? We, as humans, according to this ancient wisdom, are the physical manifestation of divine emotional joy. So now we have Atum, Shu, and Tefnut, three divine beings standing together on their small mound of earth in the midst of infinite chaos. The fundamental forces of creation are beginning to organize themselves. But the story doesn't end here, because these three could not remain in isolation forever. The universe demanded more. Creation demanded continuation. The forces set in motion by Atum's loneliness needed to move forward into new forms and new relationships. Now, here's where we turn our attention fully to Shu, because his role in the next chapter of creation is absolutely crucial, arguably more crucial than even he himself understood. Shu was not merely the passive personification of air and wind. He was also a god of light, a god of peace, the personification of the principle of separation itself, where Atum was the creator and the spark. Shu would become the sustainer, the force that held everything in its proper place, the power that prevented chaos from overwhelming order, that quite literally kept the universe from collapsing back into the none from which it came. Shu was typically depicted in Egyptian art as a man of slender build, often wearing the distinctive double plume of an ostrich feather on his head. This feather was symbolic of something profound. It represented lightness, emptiness, the minimal weight needed to sustain all of reality. The ostrich feather had been chosen deliberately by Egyptian artists and priests because it conveyed a paradox perfectly. Something so light it could float on air itself, yet essential enough to be worn as a crown by a god. Shu's very appearance was a visual koan, a riddle about the nature of existence itself. In some depictions, Shu appears with his arms raised, his hands pressed upward as if bearing an enormous weight, and indeed he was bearing an enormous weight, quite literally in fact, because it was Shu's destiny to support the sky itself. The weight of the heavens rested upon his divine shoulders. But we're getting ahead of our story. Before Shu could become the god who held up the heavens, before he could take on this eternal burden, something else had to happen first, something between two gods who were family. What aspects of mythology interest you most? Do you find yourself drawn more to the creation myths or to the stories of conflict and heroism? For me, these origin moments fascinate me the most, because they reveal what a civilization values and how they understand the world. The fact that the Egyptians focused on loneliness and companionship in their creation myth tells us something profound about their own values. Perhaps it reflects the deep need for connection that all humans share. Shu and Tefnut, despite being brother and sister, did something that would have scandalized the Egyptians of a much later age, though for the gods of creation, such relationships seemed perfectly natural and necessary. Shu and Tefnut came together in an embrace, not a wholesome family hug, but an intimate union, a sacred mating between the god of air and the goddess of moisture. Their bodies intertwined, their essences mingled, and from this union something remarkable emerged. Two new divine beings came into being, Geb and Nut. Geb was the personification of earth itself, solid and fertile, the ground beneath all living things. Nut was the personification of the sky, the vast expanse of space above, studded eventually with stars, crossed by the sun's eternal journey. Now we have four divine beings arranged in a profound cosmic arrangement. Atum remains at the origin, the first being, the self-created one who initiated everything. Shu and Tefnut represent the fundamental forces of air and moisture, the elements that allow life to exist. Their children, Geb and Nut, represent the two great realms of existence, earth and sky, the world below and the world above, matter and space. This hierarchy of creation reveals the Egyptian understanding of cosmic order. Each level builds upon the last, like a hierarchy of meaning itself. But here's where the story becomes genuinely dramatic, because Geb and Nut did something that echoed their parents' behavior, but took it to an extreme. They fell utterly, passionately, completely in love with one another. They embraced constantly, remaining locked in a perpetual union, unwilling to separate for even a moment. They lay together in an eternal embrace, with Geb beneath and Nut above, unable and unwilling to part. It was romantic in a way. Two cosmic forces united in perfect love, inseparable, complete in one another. But romance, even divine romance, can have consequences. Sometimes love, when pursued without limit, can threaten the very existence it seeks to celebrate. This presented a rather significant problem for the continued existence of creation itself. Geb, as the earth, and Nut, as the sky, were supposed to maintain their separation. There was supposed to be space between them. Space where life could exist, where beings could move and breathe and grow. With Geb and Nut locked in their endless embrace, they were blocking out that necessary space. No light could pass between them, no air could flow. The barrier between earth and sky was becoming impenetrable. Creation was beginning to suffocate. The entire cosmos was being crushed under the weight of their passion for each other. What had been beautiful was becoming catastrophic. This is where Shu's role as the god of air and separation became vitally important. Atum looked upon his warring cosmic elements with divine exasperation. Because the problem, you see, is that you can't really order your children around. not when they're fundamental forces of nature. Their emotions aren't subject to discipline. But Shu had an idea. He possessed the power that his father Atum possessed. The power to manipulate creation itself. The ability to reshape the fundamental structure of reality. And so Shu, the god of air, the god of space and separation, stepped between his children Geb and Nut, and began to lift. With hands raised high, muscles strained by the effort of holding back one of the fundamental forces of existence, Shu lifted Nut away from Geb. The sky, which until that moment had been nothing but darkness and moisture and endless rain, was raised higher and higher above the earth, inch by inch, meter by meter, higher into the void, creating more and more space, more and more distance between the lovers. And in doing this, in this act of cosmic separation, Shu created something that had never existed before, the atmosphere. He created the space where air could flow, where wind could blow, where creatures could eventually breathe. By separating earth from sky, by holding them apart with every fibre of his divine being, Shu created the very condition necessary for life as we know it to exist. Imagine the significance of this moment. Shu didn't merely perform a physical action, a task that could be completed and forgotten. He made a cosmic sacrifice, an eternal commitment. He positioned himself between Geb and Nut, literally holding them apart with every ounce of his divine strength. And in doing so, he made it impossible for himself to rest. For all of eternity, Shu would have to maintain this separation, never resting, never relaxing, never surrendering to fatigue. He became the principle of space itself, the gap between things, the emptiness that paradoxically made fullness possible. This sacrifice defines what Shu is eternally. The Egyptians believed that 4 great pillars, called the Pillars of Shu, stood at the cardinal points of the world, north, south, east, and west. These pillars helped to maintain this separation between earth and sky. They were invisible to human eyes, but absolutely real in the cosmic order. They prevented the sky from crashing down, prevented chaos from overwhelming creation. And all of these pillars, in essence, were Shu himself, extended and multiplied, eternal and tireless. This image of the pillars represents the distributing of an eternal burden across space itself. Now, you might think that this separation was final and complete, that Geb and Nut remained forever apart, unable even to see one another across the vast gulf that Shu had created. But that's not quite how the Egyptian mind worked. The Egyptians understood nuance, understood the complexity of existence, understood that the world could not be reduced to simple binaries. Although Geb and Nut were separated, they were still able to see each other. They could still communicate across the space that Shu maintained, and in their eternal longing for one another, in their desire to remain connected despite the separation, they created something beautiful and new. Nut, despite being held away from her lover Geb, remained pregnant from their union, and while separated by Shu's divine strength, she gave birth to a new generation of gods. 5 children who would themselves become central to Egyptian mythology and to the cycle of creation and destruction, the endless turning wheel that governed the cosmos. These children were Osiris, Isis, Set, Nephthys, and Horus the Elder. Each would play a vital role in what comes next in Egyptian mythology, though that is a story for another time, another night, another conversation between us in the darkness. What's remarkable about Shu is that he achieved something almost impossible. He maintained perfect balance. He held back chaos without destroying it. He kept creation from collapsing, without making it rigid or unchanging. His role as the god of air, of lightness, of emptiness, All of these seemingly passive qualities turned out to be the most essential forces in existence. Without Shu's constant, tireless effort, without his willingness to bear the weight of the sky upon his shoulders, without his sacrifice of ease and rest, there would be nothing. There would only be chaos reuniting with chaos, sky falling into earth, none reclaiming everything that had been so briefly separated from it. When the ancient Egyptians looked up at the sky, they were seeing Nut's body held in place by Shu's strength. When they felt the wind on their face, they were feeling Shu's presence. His continuing work to keep air and space alive. When they walked on the solid earth beneath their feet, they were walking on the back of Geb, safe and stable only because Shu held the sky high above. The universe, in the Egyptian understanding, was not a machine that ran on its own. It required constant divine effort, constant divine presence, constant divine sacrifice to maintain. Honestly, when I think about Shu's commitment to his task, never resting, never complaining, I wonder what god in any mythology best represents the unglamorous work of keeping things going. For me, it has to be Shu, because his sacrifice isn't the dramatic kind that gets stories told about it. It's the quiet kind that keeps everything else alive. And I think that's worth acknowledging. What do you think? Which god would you choose to represent the silent, essential work that holds reality together? And this brings us to a profound truth about Shu, a truth that we often overlook when studying ancient mythology. Shu was not a god of conquest or dominion. He was not a god of judgment or vengeance. Shu was a god of balance, of persistence, of the unglamorous work of keeping things in their proper place. He was the god who showed up every single day, in every single moment, and did his job without complaint, without expectation of reward or recognition. In many ways, Shu is the most essential god in the Egyptian pantheon, even if he's often overshadowed by more dramatic deities. The Egyptians understood something profound that we too often forget. The real work of creation isn't just the initial act of bringing things into being. The real work is the maintenance, the constant effort to keep chaos at bay, to maintain balance, to ensure that order doesn't collapse under its own weight, or under the pressure from the forces of chaos that surround it constantly. This is Shu's role, and it is a role that continues eternally. It is the role that Shu performs in every moment, in every second, forever. So here we are, having traced the journey from absolute nothingness to a universe that is beginning to take shape. We began with Atum, alone on his mound, driven by loneliness to create. We watched him bring forth Shu and Tefnut, air and moisture, life and order. We saw Shu and Tefnut create Geb and Nut, earth and sky, and we witnessed Shu's greatest sacrifice, positioning himself between earth and sky, holding them apart with his strength, creating the space necessary for life itself to exist. The next generation of gods is already emerging, already beginning their own stories, their own dramas, their own struggles with love and duty, their own struggles with the weight of cosmic responsibility. But that, as I said, is a tale for another evening. For now, we have traced the fundamental forces of creation itself, watched order emerge from chaos, and begun to understand the Egyptian vision of how the universe came to be. What strikes me most powerfully about this creation story is its emphasis on loneliness, on sacrifice, on the work required to maintain creation. The Egyptians were not interested in a universe that sprung fully formed from some distant creator's thought. They were interested in a universe that required constant effort, constant attention, constant presence. They understood that creation was not a past event, but an ongoing process, something that had to be renewed and maintained every single day. When Egyptians looked at their world, at the fertile Nile Valley surrounded by desert, at the cycles of flooding and drought, they saw in these natural patterns the eternal struggle between order and chaos. They saw Shu's constant work, they saw the necessity of balance, and they understood that their own actions, their own commitment to ma'at, to order, truth and justice, was essential to maintaining the cosmos itself. They weren't just observers in creation, they were participants in it. Their daily rituals, their moral choices, their commitment to order, these things mattered cosmically. So the next time you feel the breeze on your face, remember that you're feeling Shu's presence, the god of air and light and separation, working to maintain the space in which you exist. When you look up at the sky arching above you, remember that it's being held in place by a god's eternal strength, by an endless sacrifice. When you stand on solid ground, remember that it's the body of Geb, and that the space between earth and sky, the precious space in which all life exists, is maintained only through constant cosmic effort. These are the gods who made your existence possible. These are the forces that continue to sustain creation every single moment. Atum, Shu, Tefnut, Geb, and Nut. They didn't just build the universe and then retire. They work every moment, every second, every breath you take. They are present in the space you occupy, in the air you breathe, in the ground beneath your feet. They are the foundation upon which all existence rests. And in understanding their stories, in contemplating their sacrifice, we begin to understand our own place in the cosmic order. Thank you for joining me in this journey tonight, until we meet again in the darkness. Now let's turn our attention to two figures who deserve far more contemplation than they typically receive in discussions of Egyptian mythology. Tefnut and Geb, the goddess of moisture and the god of earth, mother and son, and in ways that will challenge our modern sensibilities, sometimes more than that, in the complex web of divine relationships that the ancient Egyptians preserved without sanitizing or simplifying. Tefnut represents something absolutely fundamental to existence itself. She is moisture, not just the personification of water, but the very principle of wetness in a civilization that understood perhaps better than any other just how precious and how dangerous water could be. Think about ancient Egypt for a moment, that narrow ribbon of green fertility running through an endless ocean of sand. The Nile Valley surrounded on all sides by desert that could kill you in hours. In that environment, moisture wasn't merely important or beneficial, it was the absolute difference between life and death, between thriving civilization and barren emptiness, between the ordered world of humanity and the chaos of the wasteland. Her name itself might be onomatopoeia, a representation of the sound of spitting, because in some versions of the creation story, Atum literally spat her into existence, along with her brother Shu. Can you imagine that image? The creator god standing alone on his primordial mound, spitting out the first two forces of creation into the darkness. It's visceral and physical and raw in a way that makes creation feel embodied rather than abstract. The Egyptians weren't interested in sanitized theology that kept divinity at a comfortable distance. They wanted creation myths that felt real, that acknowledged the messy and fluid and sometimes uncomfortable nature of existence itself. Tefnut was typically depicted as a woman with the head of a lioness, crowned with the solar disk and the Uraeus serpent coiled upon her brow, or sometimes as a full lioness prowling through the desert. This imagery is crucial because lions in Egypt represented a profound paradox that defined Tefnut's entire nature. They were fierce and dangerous and capable of tearing apart anything that crossed their path. But they were also protective and maternal and devoted to their pride with an intensity that bordered on the sacred. This dual nature defined everything about Tefnut. She could be gentle moisture, life-giving rain, the soft mist of morning that kissed the earth awake. But she could also be burning fury, the vengeful rage that scorched the desert, the bloodthirsty destroyer who roamed the wasteland. The Egyptians understood something we often forget, that the same force could nurture or annihilate depending on its balance and its relationship to the cosmic order they called Ma'at. There's a famous myth about Tefnut that reveals this dual nature perfectly and helps us understand why the Egyptians saw her as both essential and potentially catastrophic. One day, for reasons that vary depending on which version you encounter, Tefnut became furiously and devastatingly angry. Some sources say she fought with her father Ra over matters of divine authority. Others suggest she simply grew tired of Egypt and its endless demands upon her. Whatever the reason, she transformed into a raging lioness and fled, abandoning Egypt entirely and traveling south into Nubia, into the distant lands where the desert stretched endlessly and she could be alone with her rage. And Egypt suffered terribly. Without Tefnut, the moisture dried up completely. The gentle dews that appeared each morning ceased. The rare rains became even rarer until they stopped entirely. The land began to wither and crack and turn brittle under the relentless sun. The cosmic balance that had been so carefully established at creation was disrupted, because you cannot simply remove one of the fundamental forces of existence without catastrophic consequences. Without Tefnut, the carefully maintained separation between order and chaos began to crumble at the edges. The Nun, that primordial ocean of formless waters, began pressing in at the boundaries of reality once more, threatening to swallow everything back into undifferentiated chaos. Ra, seeing the disaster unfolding across his land, knew he had to act quickly. But he couldn't simply command Tefnut to return, because the gods, for all their power, still possessed free will and still made choices and still held grudges that could last for ages. So Ra sent 2 gods after her into the wilderness: Thoth, the god of wisdom and magic and words, and Shu, her own brother-husband who understood her better than anyone. Their mission was to find the angry lioness in the wasteland and somehow convince her to return to Egypt, to resume her place in the cosmic order that was collapsing without her. This was no simple diplomatic mission. Tefnut in her rage was nearly unapproachable, covered in blood from her hunting, wild-eyed and furious, roaming the desert like a force of nature that had broken free from all constraint and all responsibility. But Thoth was clever and understood that force would never work against a goddess who could simply flee deeper into the wilderness. He approached her not with commands or demands or threats, but with stories. He told her about Egypt and how it suffered without her presence. He reminded her of her importance and her irreplaceable role in maintaining creation itself. He spoke to her not as a subject pleading with a superior, but as one divine being acknowledging another's pain while also acknowledging the pain her absence was causing to the entire world. Slowly and gradually, Tefnut's rage began to cool. The lioness began to remember who she was, not just an angry and abandoned deity fleeing into the wilderness, but a fundamental force of creation whose very existence mattered cosmically. She agreed to return. And as she made her way back to Egypt, something remarkable happened that demonstrated the transformation occurring within her. Her mood shifted completely. The angry and bloodthirsty lioness became gentle again, nurturing and life-giving. By the time she reached the borders of Egypt, she had transformed from the fierce destroyer back into the beneficent Tefnut, and the moisture returned to the land, the dews reappeared each morning, and balance was restored to creation. This myth tells us something crucial about how the Egyptians understood their gods and the forces that sustained their world. Divine beings weren't perfect or unchanging or beyond the reach of emotion. They had conflicts and feelings and could make mistakes. could abandon responsibilities in fits of rage that threatened cosmic order itself. But they could also be reconciled and brought back into balance, reminded of their purpose and their essential role in the great pattern of existence. The gods were powerful beyond human comprehension, yet they were also in some profound way relatable, subject to the same emotional forces that drive all conscious beings toward both creation and destruction. Now let's turn to Geb, the earth god, son of Shu and Tefnut, brother and husband to Nut, the sky goddess. Geb represents the solid ground beneath our feet, the fertility of the soil that produces grain and vegetation, the wealth hidden in the earth's depths. Every growing thing emerged from his body according to Egyptian belief. Grain was said to grow from his ribs like a harvest of divine bones. Vegetation sprouted from his back like hair. Fresh water bubbled up from his gift to humanity. His laughter caused earthquakes that shook the foundations of buildings. His anger could make the earth crack and buckle and swallow entire cities into chasms. Geb was typically shown as a man, sometimes coloured green or black to represent fertility and the rich Nile silt that made Egypt's agriculture possible. Often he was depicted reclining beneath the arched body of Nut, forever gazing up at his beloved sister-wife, forever separated from her by their father Shu, who stood between them with arms raised, holding the sky away from the earth and creating the space necessary for life to exist. We've already discussed this separation, this tragic romance of Geb and Nut, two cosmic lovers pulled apart by cosmic necessity, their eternal longing for each other, creating a tension that somehow made the world possible. But there's another story about Geb that doesn't appear as prominently in popular retellings, one that makes us deeply uncomfortable, yet was preserved in ancient texts and whispered in fragmentary inscriptions, and reconstructed from scattered references that the ancient Egyptians themselves seem to have found both important and unsettling. After Shu separated Geb from Nut, after the earth god was torn away from his beloved sister-wife, after the cosmic order was established through that painful division, Geb did something that violated every principle of that newly established order. He turned to his mother, to Tefnut. The sources are fragmentary and debated by scholars, but the essence of the story appears in multiple places, in pyramid texts and temple inscriptions and references that are sometimes explicit and sometimes frustratingly vague. After losing Nut, after being forcibly separated from the love that defined his existence, Geb sought something. Comfort, perhaps, or revenge, or perhaps in his grief and rage at cosmic injustice he simply acted in a way that defied divine law itself. He seduced Tefnut, his own mother, the goddess of moisture. And in some versions of the story, it wasn't seduction at all, but force, an act of violence against the divine order itself and against the goddess who had given him existence. This is deeply uncomfortable, and there's no way to make it comfortable or to explain it away. The Egyptians themselves seemed conflicted about it. Some texts speak of it as a marriage, as if legitimizing the relationship through proper divine ritual. Others refer to it as an assault, a violation that demanded punishment. Some present it as a transgression that threatened to unravel cosmic order and had to be corrected by other gods. Others seem to accept it as simply another aspect of divine complexity, another layer in the intricate web of relationships that bound the gods together in ways that both sustained and threatened the world. Why would this story exist at all? What purpose did it serve in Egyptian religious thought? Perhaps it acknowledged an uncomfortable truth about power and those who hold it, that beings who literally contain the earth itself in their divine nature might feel entitled to take what they want regardless of cosmic law. Perhaps it reflected anxieties about succession and what happens when the older generation must give way to the younger, when parents must acknowledge that their children have become powerful enough to challenge them. Perhaps it was a way of explaining certain natural phenomena through divine relationships, the way earth absorbs moisture, the way soil and water interact in the process of creating fertility and life. Or perhaps, most disturbingly, it was a way of acknowledging that creation itself is not entirely benevolent or ordered, that the forces sustaining life can also violate it, that power, even divine power exercised by the gods responsible for maintaining cosmic order, can be abused and turned against that very order. The Egyptians were remarkable in their willingness to preserve uncomfortable truths about existence and about the gods who sustained it. They didn't sanitize their mythology or pretend that the gods were always noble or just or kind. They presented them as powerful and essential and worthy of worship and respect, but also as capable of acts that violated the very principles they were supposed to maintain and protect. The consequences of this union between Geb and Tefnut aren't entirely clear from the fragmentary sources that survive. Some scholars suggest it resulted in divine children who represented aspects of earth and moisture combined. Others suggest it caused cosmic disruption that required intervention from Ra or from other gods to restore balance. What's clear is that it represented a moment of profound disorder, a violation of the carefully established relationships that held creation together. Shu, as both Geb's father and Tefnut's husband, would have faced an impossible situation. His son had violated his wife, his mother, and the god of air and separation was confronted with something he couldn't simply separate. A violation that had already occurred, a line that had already been crossed, damage that couldn't be undone, but only somehow absorbed into the ongoing pattern of cosmic order. This brings us to something important about both Tefnut and Geb, and their relationship to the cosmic order that sustained Egyptian civilization. Both of them, in different ways, represented forces that could nurture or destroy depending on their balance and their relationship to Ma'at. Tefnut as moisture could give life through gentle rains and morning dew, or could withhold herself entirely and abandon Egypt to drought and death. Geb as earth could be fertile and abundant, providing endless harvests and sustaining millions of people, or could become barren and deadly, imprisoning the dead within himself, cracking open to swallow the living, withholding his gifts until humanity starved. Both of them embodied the Egyptian understanding that creation is not static or stable or guaranteed, that the forces maintaining reality are in constant tension with each other and with the chaos that surrounds ordered existence, that these forces are constantly threatening to overflow their boundaries, to violate the rules that keep them in productive relationship rather than destructive conflict. The Egyptians lived with this tension daily in every aspect of their lives. They saw it in the Nile's flood cycle, waters that could bring fertility or devastation depending on whether they rose too little or too much. They saw it in the sun's daily journey across the sky, light that could nurture crops or scorch the earth to lifeless dust. They saw it in the desert pressing in on all sides of their narrow green valley, the ever-present reminder that chaos was always there, always waiting, always threatening to overwhelm order if the cosmic forces didn't maintain their careful balance. Tefnut and Geb, as mother and son, as moisture and earth, represented perhaps the most essential partnership in this balance. Without moisture, earth becomes desert, lifeless and unable to support anything at all. Without earth, moisture has nowhere to go, no way to become useful, no way to transform into the vegetation and sustenance that life requires. They needed each other cosmically, which makes their transgressive relationship even more complicated and unsettling. The forces that must work together for creation to function were also forces that could violate each other in ways that threatened everything. In Egyptian art and temple reliefs, Tefnut appears less frequently than many other deities. She's overshadowed by her more famous relatives, by Ra and Osiris and Isis and Horus, whose cults dominated major temple complexes and whose myths captured popular imagination. But when she does appear in artwork and inscriptions, it's often in contexts directly related to cosmic order and the maintenance of Ma'at. She appears alongside Shu, the two of them working together to support Nut and maintain the separation between earth and sky. She appears as the Eye of Ra, the fierce protector of divine authority who would burn away anyone who threatened the sun god's sovereignty. She appears in royal contexts, associated with the uraeus cobra that adorned pharaohs' crowns as a symbol of the burning and protective power that would destroy anyone who threatened the king's divine authority. Geb similarly appears in contexts related to kingship and succession, because Pharaoh was understood as the living Horus, son of Osiris, and Osiris was son of Geb. The divine right to rule Egypt passed through Geb's lineage, making him essential to the legitimacy of every pharaoh who ever wore the double crown. When a pharaoh died, he was said to return to Geb, to be absorbed back into the earth from which all life springs and to which all life returns. The fertility of Egypt's fields was attributed to Geb's generosity, and failed harvests or earthquakes were understood as signs of his displeasure with humanity or with the current ruler. The relationship between Tefnut and Geb, between moisture and earth, plays out every single day in ways the ancient Egyptians would have recognized immediately. Morning dew appears on the ground like Tefnut kissing Geb in the darkness before dawn. Rain falls and is absorbed into soil, moisture, and earth combining to create fertility. Rivers flow through valleys carved into the land, water and stone in constant negotiation. The Nile floods each year, moisture overwhelming earth temporarily before receding to reveal rich silt deposited for the coming planting season. These natural phenomena weren't just physical processes to the Egyptians. They were the ongoing relationships between gods, the continuing drama of divine beings whose interactions literally sustained the world. When Tefnut withheld her moisture, when drought came to Egypt, it wasn't simply a weather pattern or a climatic anomaly. It was a divine decision, a goddess choosing to withdraw her presence, and it required not just practical responses like digging wells or rationing water, but religious responses like rituals and offerings and prayers to convince her to return. When Geb provided abundant harvests, when the grain grew thick and the fields overflowed with produce, it wasn't just good agricultural management or fortunate weather. It was a god choosing to bless Egypt with his fertility, and it required gratitude and acknowledgement through offerings at temples and proper observance of festivals. What strikes me most powerfully about these two deities is how the Egyptians understood them as both utterly essential and potentially catastrophic. There was no guarantee that Tefnut would provide moisture or that Geb would provide fertility. These weren't mechanical processes that operated according to fixed laws. They were relationships that had to be maintained, divine beings who had to be honored and placated and reminded of their roles in cosmic order. The Egyptians understood that creation was not a past event, something that happened once at the beginning of time and then continued automatically. Creation was an ongoing process that required constant effort and attention, constant maintenance of the relationships between the forces that sustained existence. When you think about moisture and earth, about Tefnut and Geb, you're thinking about the most fundamental requirements for life as we know it. You cannot have vegetation without both. You cannot have civilization without agriculture. You cannot have humanity without the food that comes from combining water and soil in the growing of crops. These two gods, mother and son, represented the absolute foundation of Egyptian existence, and the Egyptians, with their characteristic insight into the complexity of reality, understood that this foundation was not stable or simple or guaranteed. It was complex and fraught with tension and capable of both sustaining everything and destroying everything depending on the balance maintained between opposing forces. Now we come to Nut, the sky goddess, and this is where Egyptian mythology reveals its most spectacular visual imagination. Picture a woman arching her body across the entire cosmos, her fingertips touching the eastern horizon and her toes touching the western horizon, her star-spangled body forming the vault of heaven itself. This is Nut, daughter of Shu and Tefnut, sister and eternal beloved of Geb the earth god, mother to some of the most important deities in the entire Egyptian pantheon. She is not simply the sky in some abstract sense, she is literally the sky, every inch of that vast blue expanse during the day and that star-filled darkness at night. When ancient Egyptians looked up, they were looking at a goddess's body stretched across the world in an eternal act of cosmic separation and cosmic embrace. The imagery is extraordinary when you really contemplate it. Nut's body forms a protective arch over all of creation, held in place by her father Shu, who stands with arms raised between her and Geb, maintaining the separation that makes life possible. Her fingers and toes touch the four cardinal directions, north and south and east and west, anchoring the sky to the edges of the world. Her body is decorated with stars, countless points of light that the Egyptians believed were divine beings themselves, or the souls of the blessed dead who had been transformed into imperishable stars. Some scholars have suggested that Nut's body represented the Milky Way, that vast river of stars flowing across the night sky, though the relationship between the goddess and the galaxy seems more complex than simple identification. But Nut's most important role, the function that made her absolutely essential to Egyptian cosmology and religion, was her relationship with the sun. Each evening at dusk, Nut swallowed the sun god Ra. She consumed him completely, drawing him into her mouth at the western horizon where the day ends. The sun then travelled through her body during the hours of darkness, journeying through her divine interior in a process that was simultaneously death and gestation. At dawn, Nut gave birth to Ra, pushing him out from between her thighs at the eastern horizon, reborn and renewed, and ready to make his journey across the sky once more. This daily cycle of death and rebirth, of consumption and generation, of endings and beginnings, was fundamental to how the Egyptians understood time and existence and the possibility of renewal after death. Think about what this means. Every single day the sun died and was reborn. Every single morning was a miracle of regeneration, proof that death was not final, evidence that the ordered world could be renewed even after being swallowed by darkness. For a civilization that lived surrounded by desert, where the sun could be both life-giver and destroyer, this mythology provided profound comfort and meaning. It promised that even the most powerful force in their world, the sun itself, underwent death and resurrection. If Ra could be reborn each morning after passing through the body of Nut, then surely human souls could also be reborn after passing through death into the afterlife. This is why Nut became one of the most important funerary deities in Egyptian religion. She was painted on the inside lids of countless sarcophagi, her star-covered body arching protectively over the mummified remains of the deceased. When someone died and was placed in their coffin, they were symbolically placed beneath Nut's body, just as Ra was placed within her body each night. The prayers carved into tombs and written on papyri appeal to Nut as a mother, asking her to protect the dead as she protected Ra, to draw them into her starry body and transform them into imperishable spirits. O my mother Nut, stretch yourself over me, that I may be placed among the imperishable stars which are in you, and that I may not die. This prayer appears again and again in funerary texts, revealing the depth of trust Egyptians placed in this goddess to shepherd them through death into new life. But before Nut could become this cosmic mother protecting all of Egypt's dead, before she could take on her role as the sky itself, she had to give birth to her own children. And this birth was anything but easy. The story of how Nut came to bear her divine children reveals the complexity of divine relationships and the ongoing tension between order and chaos that characterized Egyptian theology. As we discussed earlier, Nut and Geb were lovers, eternally embracing, unwilling to separate even though their union prevented the space necessary for other life to exist. When Shu separated them, creating the atmosphere and the space between earth and sky, Nut was already pregnant with 5 divine children. But Ra, the supreme sun god, had heard a prophecy that troubled him deeply. It was foretold that one of Nut's children would eventually supplant him, would take his place as the ruler of the gods and the cosmos. Ra, despite all his power and authority, felt threatened by this prophecy. He responded as powerful beings often do when they feel their authority challenged. He issued a decree, a curse that was meant to prevent Nut from ever giving birth to the children who might threaten his supremacy. He declared that Nut would not be able to give birth on any day of the year. Not in any of the 360 days that made up the Egyptian calendar. She would remain eternally pregnant, her children trapped within her divine body, unable to enter the world and fulfill whatever destiny awaited them. This was cruel in a way that reveals the darker aspects of divine power. Nut had done nothing wrong except conceive children with her husband. Yet she was being punished for a prophecy she had no part in creating, condemned to eternal pregnancy because Ra feared what her children might become. The curse seemed absolute and unbreakable. Ra's word was law in the cosmos he had helped create. His decrees shaped reality itself. How could Nut possibly circumvent a prohibition that covered every single day of the year? But Nut was not powerless, and she was certainly not willing to accept this fate without resistance. She sought help from Thoth, the god of wisdom and magic and writing, the divine intellect who could find loopholes in even the most absolute prohibitions. Thoth listened to Nut's dilemma and immediately saw the solution, clever and elegant in the way that only Thoth's solutions could be. Ra had declared that Nut could not give birth on any day of the year, but what if there were days that existed outside the year? What if they could create time that wasn't covered by Ra's curse? Thoth went to Khonsu, the moon god, and challenged him to a game of chance. Khonsu, like many gods, couldn't resist a good gamble, even when Thoth warned him of the stakes. They played throughout the night, game after game, and with each loss, Khonsu was forced to surrender a portion of his moonlight to Thoth. In those ancient days, according to the myth, the moon shone as brightly as the sun, rivaling Ra's brilliance in the night sky. But by the time Thoth finished playing with Khonsu, the moon god had lost so much of his light that he became the dimmer orb we see today, waxing and waning throughout the month, rather than maintaining constant brilliance. Thoth gathered all the moonlight he had won and used it to create 5 additional days, 5 days that existed outside the regular 360 days of the Egyptian year. These days, called the epigomenal days, were added to the end of the calendar, and because they existed outside Ra's original decree, Nut was free to give birth during them. On each of these 5 days, Nut brought forth one of her children. First came Osiris, born on the first extra day. Then came Horus the Elder on the second day, sometimes called Horus, to distinguish him from Horus the son of Osiris and Isis. On the third day came Set, the god of chaos and violence. On the 4th day came Isis, goddess of magic and motherhood. And on the 5th and final day came Nephthys, goddess of mourning and the transition between life and death. These 5 children would shape the entire course of Egyptian mythology and religion. But of all of them, it is Osiris who concerns us most deeply now. Osiris the firstborn, the one who inherited kingship over the earth from his father Geb, the one whose story would become the most elaborate and influential myth in all of Egyptian culture. Osiris represents everything the Egyptians valued about kingship and civilization, and the proper ordering of society. He was the god of fertility and agriculture, the one who taught humanity how to cultivate grain and make bread, how to brew beer and tend vineyards, how to organize society according to the principles of Ma'at, that cosmic order and justice and balance that sustained the world. In his original role, before his death and transformation, Osiris was the rightful king of Egypt, ruling in the Golden Age when gods walked among humans and the land was abundantly fertile and people lived according to divine law. He was married to his sister Isis, the goddess whose magic and devotion would later become legendary. Together they represented the ideal royal couple, king and queen united in both love and purpose, maintaining Egypt's prosperity through their perfect partnership. Osiris taught the people agriculture and civilization and law. Isis taught them weaving and healing and magic. Under their rule, Egypt flourished in ways that later generations would remember with longing. But Osiris had a brother, Set, the god born on the 3rd epigomenal day, and Set harbored jealousy and resentment toward his older brother's power and position. The reasons for Set's hatred vary depending on which version of the myth you encounter. Some texts suggest that Set was simply evil by nature, that he represented chaos and disorder, and therefore naturally opposed Osiris, who represented order and cultivation. Other versions give him more concrete motivations. In some tellings, Set is angry because Osiris slept with Nephthys, Set's own wife and sister, either through deception or force, depending on the source. In others, Set simply covets the throne and the power that comes with it, unable to accept that he must serve under his older brother rather than rule himself. Whatever his motivation, Set plotted to murder Osiris and take his throne. The murder itself is rarely described explicitly in Egyptian texts because the Egyptians believed that written words had power to affect reality. To describe Osiris's death in detail would be to risk somehow perpetuating or reinforcing that death to give it more reality than necessary. So the texts speak around it, allude to it, reference it indirectly. We know that Set killed Osiris, that the murder was violent and violated every principle of Ma'at that should govern relationships between kin. We know that in some versions Set dismembered Osiris's body, scattering the pieces across Egypt to prevent his brother from ever being whole again. We know that this murder represented the ultimate triumph of chaos over order, of violence over civilization, of death over life. And this is where Nut's relationship with Osiris becomes most poignant and most important. Osiris, the god who had been born from Nut's body on that first epigomenal day, who had emerged into the world through her divine birth, was now dead, murdered by his own brother, his body scattered and lost, his kingdom usurped by the very forces of chaos he had spent his life trying to contain. In this moment of absolute crisis, when order itself seemed to have failed, when the proper king had been overthrown and murdered, Osiris turned to his mother. Or rather, his soul turned to his mother, because what else can the dead do except seek the comfort and protection of the one who gave them life? According to some versions of the myth, after Isis gathered the pieces of Osiris's body and performed the rituals that partially restored him, after she used her magic to conceive their son Horus, even though Osiris was dead, after all these miraculous and terrible events, Osiris climbed a ladder to reach Nut's body. This ladder was a sacred symbol called the Maquet, and it represented the pathway between earth and sky, between the world of the living and the world of the dead, between the realm of Geb and the realm of Nut. Osiris ascended this ladder to escape the continued threat from Set, to find sanctuary in the body of his mother who arched protectively across the cosmos. Nut received her son into her body just as she received Ra each evening. She drew Osiris into her starry interior, transforming him from a murdered king into something else entirely, something more essential and more powerful in its own way than he had been in life. Osiris became the lord of the afterlife, the god of the dead, the one who presided over the judgment of souls and the transformation of the deceased into blessed spirits. His death, rather than being an ending, became a gateway into a new existence. His transformation from living king to dead god actually increased his importance, because now he ruled over a realm that every single Egyptian would eventually enter. Death was not the end, but a transformation, not a defeat, but a passage into Osiris's kingdom. And Nut's role in this transformation cannot be overstated. Just as she swallowed Ra each evening and gave birth to him renewed each morning, just as she transformed the dying sun into the reborn sun through the alchemy of her divine body, she transformed her murdered son Osiris from a dead king into an eternal god. She provided the sanctuary he needed to complete his metamorphosis. She protected him from Set's continuing violence. She held him within herself until his new form was established and his new kingdom in the underworld was ready to receive him. This is the role of the cosmic mother, not just to give birth, but to receive back what has died and transform it into something that can live again in a different way. The parallel between Ra's journey and Osiris's journey through Nut's body became one of the most important theological concepts in Egyptian religion. When someone died, their soul was said to follow the same path that both Ra and Osiris had followed. They entered Nut's body, travelling through her interior during the hours of darkness, undergoing transformation and judgment and purification. If they were found worthy, if their heart weighed correctly against the feather of Ma'at in Osiris's Hall of Judgment, if they passed all the tests and spoke all the correct spells from the Book of the Dead, then they would be reborn like Ra, emerging from Nut's body transformed into Akh, imperishable spirits who would dwell among the stars forever. This is why Nut appears so prominently in funerary art and texts. She's not simply decoration on a coffin lid, she's the promise of transformation and rebirth. She's the assurance that death is not an ending but a passage through a divine body that can transform the dead into something eternal. When a person was mummified and placed in their sarcophagus with Nut's image above them, they were being symbolically placed in the position that both Ra and Osiris had occupied. They were being given the same opportunity for transformation and renewal that the gods themselves had experienced. The relationship between Nut and Osiris also reveals something profound about Egyptian attitudes toward motherhood and protection. Nut is not simply a passive container or a distant cosmic principle. She is actively maternal, actively protective, actively involved in shepherding her children through their most difficult transitions. When Osiris was murdered, when he needed sanctuary, he turned to his mother and she received him. When the dead need protection and transformation, they appeal to Nut as a mother, asking her to stretch herself over them, to enfold them, to draw them into her body where they can be safe and transformed. This is motherhood at a cosmic scale, protection and nurturing and transformation that extends beyond individual care to become the fundamental pattern by which all souls can hope for renewal after death. There's something deeply moving about this vision of the cosmos. The sky itself is reimagined as a mother's body arched protectively over the earth, holding all the stars within herself like children, swallowing the sun each night to renew it, receiving the dead to transform them. It's a cosmology that emphasizes protection and care and the possibility of transformation rather than emphasizing judgment or punishment or the finality of death. Yes, there is judgment in Osiris's hall. Yes, there are dangers in the afterlife journey. Yes, not everyone successfully completes the transformation. But the fundamental image is one of a mother receiving her children back, holding them through the dangerous passage of death, helping them emerge renewed on the other side. The myth also addresses something that every human civilization must grapple with, the problem of death, and especially the problem of unjust death. Osiris was the rightful king, the good ruler, the one who brought civilization and order and prosperity to Egypt. His murder was not just personally tragic, but cosmically unjust. It represented the triumph of chaos over order, of violence over law, of Set's destructive power over Osiris's creative power. How could such an injustice stand? How could the cosmos allow the murder of its rightful king to go unanswered? The answer the myth provides is transformation. Osiris's death is not reversed. He does not return to life in the simple sense. He doesn't resume his throne on earth or continue his rule over the living. Instead, his death becomes the foundation for an entirely new realm of existence. Because Osiris has died, because he has passed through Nut's transformative body and emerged as Lord of the afterlife, there is now a divine king who understands death from the inside. There is now a God who can judge the dead fairly because he himself has experienced death. There is now a pathway for all humans to follow, a pattern of death and transformation and renewal that Osiris has pioneered and that all subsequent souls can hope to replicate. This is what scholars mean when they talk about Osiris as a dying and rising god, though the rising is more complex than simple resurrection. Osiris dies and is transformed. He enters a new mode of existence that is in some ways more powerful and more important than his original existence as king of the living. His death becomes generative rather than merely tragic. It creates possibilities that didn't exist before. Every single Egyptian could now look forward to an afterlife presided over by a god who understood their fear and their hope, who had experienced the passage through death himself and emerged transformed. And Nut is central to making this transformation possible. Without her protective body to receive Osiris, without her transformative power to change him from murdered corpse into eternal king of the dead, the entire system of afterlife beliefs that sustained Egyptian civilization would collapse. Nut provides the space where transformation can occur, the sanctuary where Osiris can become what he needs to become, the cosmic womb that can give birth to new modes of existence, just as it gave birth to the original gods and to the renewed sun each morning. When you understand this, you begin to see why Nut and Osiris together formed such a crucial pairing in Egyptian religious imagination. They represent the promise that death can be transformed into life, that murder and chaos and destruction are not the final words, that there exists a cosmic mother who can receive back what has been destroyed and reshape it into something eternal. This isn't cheap comfort or wishful thinking. It's a sophisticated theological response to the universal human confrontation with death and injustice and the apparent triumph of chaos over order. The Egyptians, living in their narrow valley surrounded by desert, constantly threatened by drought and invasion and the breakdown of Ma'at, needed this vision of cosmic order ultimately prevailing despite temporary setbacks. They needed to believe that Osiris, though murdered, became more powerful in death than he was in life. They needed to believe that Nut would protect them as she protected her son, drawing them into her starry body and transforming them into eternal beings. They needed to believe that the pattern Ra followed each night: death at sunset, journey through darkness, rebirth at dawn, was not just the sun's pattern. but could be every soul's pattern if they prepared properly and lived according to Ma'at and trusted in the transformative power of the Cosmic Mother. This is mythology, operating at its highest level, not just telling stories about gods, but providing a comprehensive framework for understanding existence and death and the possibility of meaning in a world where unjust things happen to good people and chaos constantly threatens to overwhelm order. Nut and Osiris together offer the promise that there is a pattern to follow through death, that there is protection available in the darkest passage, that transformation is possible even after the most complete destruction, and that a mother's love, extended to cosmic proportions, can shelter all her children through the terrifying journey from life through death into whatever lies beyond. Now we turn to Isis and Set, two deities locked in a conflict that would span generations and define the entire structure of Egyptian thought about order versus chaos, justice versus violence, magic versus brute force. These two represent opposing principles so fundamental that their struggle became the template for understanding every conflict between righteousness and wickedness that ancient Egyptians would ever encounter. But their relationship is far more complex than simple opposition, far more nuanced than a straightforward battle between good and evil. Because Set, for all his violence and chaos, was not always considered evil, and Isis, for all her wisdom and magic, was capable of ruthlessness that rivaled her brother's brutality. Let's begin with Isis, because she deserves to be understood in her full complexity rather than reduced to the role of grieving widow or devoted mother that later traditions sometimes imposed upon her. Isis was born on the fourth of the 5 epigomenal days that Thoth created from his winnings against the moon god. She emerged from Nut's body as the goddess of magic, throne, motherhood, protection, and transformation. Her name in Egyptian, Aset, means throne or seat, and she was often depicted wearing a throne-shaped headdress that proclaimed her connection to royal power and legitimate kingship. When pharaohs sat upon their thrones, they were symbolically sitting in Isis's lap, drawing their authority from her divine sanction. But Isis was far more than a symbol of queenship. She possessed Heka, the Egyptian word for magic that encompasses creative power, divine authority, and the ability to manipulate the fundamental forces of reality itself. In fact, according to some myths, Isis became the most powerful magician in all of existence through an act of cunning and deception that reveals just how ambitious and calculating she could be. The story goes that when Isis was young, she coveted the supreme magical power held by Ra, the aging sun god who still ruled over creation. Ra guarded his true name jealously, because in Egyptian belief, to know something's true name was to have power over it. If Isis could learn Ra's secret name, she could command even the creator god himself. So Isis devised a plan that was brilliant and cruel in equal measure. She watched Ra during his daily journey across the sky, and she noticed that in his old age he had begun to drool, his divine saliva falling to earth and mixing with dust. Isis collected some of this mixture of saliva and earth, and from it she fashioned a serpent, a creature that had never existed before, something that Ra himself had never created and therefore had no natural defense against. She placed this serpent on the path that Ra travelled each day, hidden where the sun god would not see it until too late. When Ra passed by, the serpent struck, sinking its fangs into the divine flesh and pumping venom into the sun god's body. Ra screamed in agony like he had never known, because this was pain inflicted by something he hadn't created, something outside the natural order he had established. The other gods came running at his cries, but none of them could help him. None of them possessed the magic to counter this unprecedented poison. Finally, Isis appeared, offering to heal him with her magic, but only if he would tell her his true name. Ra, desperate and suffering, tried to bargain, listing all his known names and titles and aspects. But Isis was not fooled. She waited, watching the poison work deeper into Ra's divine body until finally the pain became unbearable and Ra whispered his true secret name into her ear alone. Immediately Isis drew the poison out and healed the sun god. But the damage was done. She now possessed his true name and with it power that rivaled or even exceeded his own. This story reveals something crucial about Isis's character. She was not simply a passive goddess of fertility or a gentle mother figure. She was ambitious and cunning and willing to cause suffering to achieve her goals. She understood power and pursued it relentlessly. She was strategic in ways that made her dangerous to anyone who opposed her. These qualities would serve her well in her coming conflict with Set, because Set respected nothing except power and cunning, and Isis possessed both in abundance. Set, the god born on the third epigomenal day, represented everything that threatened the ordered world of Egypt. He was the god of the desert, that vast wasteland of sand and stone that surrounded the green valley where civilization clung to life. He was the god of storms and violence and foreigners and everything that came from outside the boundaries of Ma'at. He was depicted as a creature that never existed in nature, a composite beast with a curved snout, square ears, and a forked tail, an animal that belonged nowhere because Set himself belonged nowhere, existing always at the margins of order, always threatening to overwhelm it. In the earliest periods of Egyptian history, Set was not purely negative. He was the god who stood at the prow of Ra's solar bark during the nightly journey through the underworld, defending the sun against Apophis, the great serpent of chaos who tried to swallow Ra and prevent the dawn from coming. Set was the only god strong enough and violent enough to fight Apophis successfully, which made him essential to the continuation of creation itself. The desert he ruled was dangerous, but it also protected Egypt from invasion. The storms he commanded were destructive, but they also demonstrated power that could be harnessed. Set represented necessary violence, the force required to defend order, even if that force was itself chaotic and barely controlled. But Set's relationship with order was always ambiguous and always unstable. He was the god who helped maintain creation against external chaos, but he was also constantly tempted to become chaos himself, to turn his violence against the very order he was supposed to protect. This tension defined everything about Set, and it made his murder of Osiris somehow inevitable even as it was utterly unjustifiable. Set looked at his older brother Osiris ruling Egypt with wisdom and justice and abundance, and something in Set's nature couldn't accept it. Whether it was jealousy or resentment or simply the chaotic urge to destroy what was good and ordered, Set murdered Osiris and claimed the throne for himself. The murder created a cosmic crisis. Osiris had been the rightful king chosen by their father Geb to rule over the earth. His death violated every principle of succession and justice and family loyalty that held Egyptian society together. Set's rule represented the triumph of chaos over order, of violence over law, of the desert over the fertile valley. Egypt suffered under Set's kingship. The land became barren, the Nile failed to flood properly. Harmony collapsed into discord. Ma'at itself was wounded, and creation groaned under the weight of this fundamental violation of cosmic order. This is where Isis enters the story as something more than a goddess of magic and thrones. She becomes the grieving widow who refuses to accept her husband's death as final, who will not allow Set's crime to stand unanswered, who possesses both the love and the power to resist chaos itself. When Osiris died, when Set either drowned him or dismembered him depending on which version of the myth you encounter, Isis did not collapse into helpless mourning. She acted with a determination and ruthlessness that matched Set's violence. She searched throughout Egypt for Osiris's body, travelling with her sister Nephthys, who had abandoned Set and joined Isis in her quest. The two goddesses went from place to place asking if anyone had seen Osiris's remains, following rumours and clues and traces of divine presence. In some versions they travelled as birds, transforming into kites whose mournful cries became the sound of mourning itself. In other versions they travelled as women, disguising themselves to move through a land now ruled by their enemy. They searched tirelessly, devotedly, with a focus that could not be broken by any of Set's attempts to stop them. When Isis finally found Osiris's body, Set discovered what she had done and flew into a rage. He seized Osiris's corpse and tore it into pieces, 14 or 16 or 42 depending on which tradition you follow, and scattered these pieces throughout Egypt so that Isis could never make her husband whole again. But Set underestimated Isis's determination and her magical power. She resumed her search, now looking for fragments rather than a whole body, and she found them one by one, gathering the pieces of her murdered husband from across the entire length and breadth of Egypt. This search became central to Egyptian religious geography. Every place where Isis supposedly found a piece of Osiris became sacred, became a site of pilgrimage and worship. The story transformed Egypt itself into Osiris's body, scattered and holy, every temple and shrine marking a place where death had been gathered up by love and magic working together. Isis's journey across Egypt searching for her husband became the template for every widow's grief, every mourner's refusal to let death have the final word, every human being's desperate hope that love might be stronger than mortality. When Isis had gathered all the pieces she could find, when she had reconstructed Osiris's body as completely as possible, she performed the first mummification, inventing the rituals that would preserve the dead and prepare them for transformation into eternal life. She and Nephthys wrapped Osiris's body in linen, anointed it with oils and unguents, spoke the spells that would protect him and restore him to a form of life, even though he could never return to the world of the living. This act of preservation and magic was so powerful, so fundamental to Egyptian thought, that every subsequent mummification was understood as a reenactment of what Isis did for Osiris. Every embalmer became Isis. Every corpse became Osiris. Every funeral was a repetition of the original transformation that Isis accomplished through love and magic combined. But Isis's magic went further still. Through spells whose power was beyond anything previously imagined, she temporarily animated Osiris's dead body, giving it enough life to accomplish one final act. She transformed herself into a bird, a kite, and hovered over Osiris's body, beating her wings to create breath in his lungs. Through this act, through magic that united the living and the dead in ways that should have been impossible, Isis conceived a child. She became pregnant with Horus even though her husband was dead, creating new life from death itself, ensuring that Osiris would have an heir who could one day challenge Set and reclaim the throne that had been stolen. This moment represents perhaps the pinnacle of Isis's power and her defiance of everything Set had tried to accomplish. Set had murdered Osiris to take the throne and end the line of succession. But Isis, through her magic, had created a new heir, a son who would grow up to challenge Set's usurped authority. Set had scattered Osiris's body to prevent his restoration, but Isis had found the pieces and made him whole enough to become the eternal king of the afterlife, more powerful in death than he had been in life. Set had tried to end the story, to make his crime permanent and unchallengeable. But Isis had written a new chapter, one in which Set would eventually face justice and lose everything he had murdered to obtain. Isis's pregnancy made her a target. Set learned that she was carrying Osiris's child, and he understood immediately what this meant. If the child lived and grew to maturity, he would have a legitimate claim to the throne, a claim that superseded Set's rule. Set hunted for Isis, determined to kill her and the child she carried before this threat could materialize. But Isis, warned by Thoth, fled into the marshes of the Nile Delta, into the papyrus thickets where she could hide among the reeds and give birth in secret. She lived there in the marshes, protected by gods and spirits who opposed Set's rule, surviving through her own magic and cunning. She gave birth to Horus in secret, far from any city or temple or witnesses who might betray her to Set. She raised him hidden in the swamps, teaching him magic and strategy and the history of what had been done to his father, preparing him for the day when he would be strong enough to challenge Set and reclaim his rightful inheritance. These years of hiding and raising Horus in secret were dangerous beyond measure. Multiple myths describe Set's attempts to find them, to kill the young god before he could mature into a threat. In one story, Isis left the young Horus hidden in the marshes while she went to beg for food in nearby villages, disguising herself as a poor widow to avoid Set's attention. When she returned, she found Horus lying dead or dying, killed by a scorpion sting. Her grief and rage were cosmic in their intensity. She screamed loud enough to stop Ra's solar bark in its journey across the sky, refusing to let creation continue while her son lay dead. Ra sent Thoth down to help her, and together they used magic powerful enough to reverse death itself, drawing the poison out of Horus's body and restoring him to life. This myth became the foundation for healing spells throughout Egyptian history, invoked whenever someone suffered from venomous bites or stings. If Isis could save Horus from death by poison, then perhaps her magic could save anyone who called upon her with sufficient devotion. When Horus finally came of age, when he had grown strong enough to challenge Set for the throne, the real conflict between Isis and Set began in earnest. This conflict was not simply her son fighting while she watched from the sidelines. Isis was actively involved in every stage of the struggle, using her magic and cunning to aid Horus and undermine Set at every opportunity. The contest between Horus and Set dragged on for 80 years according to some texts, taking multiple forms as each god tried to prove he was the rightful king of Egypt. The gods assembled as a tribunal to decide between them, a divine court where Horus's claim based on inheritance confronted Set's claim based on strength and possession. Most of the gods favored Horus because his claim was legitimate, based on proper succession from father to son. But Ra, the supreme judge, surprisingly favored Set, perhaps because he valued Set's strength and violence as necessary qualities for a king, or perhaps because he still feared the prophecy that one of Nut's children would supplant him, and saw Set as less threatening than Osiris's line. During these proceedings, Isis used every trick and stratagem she had learned. On one occasion, she transformed herself into a beautiful young woman and told Set a story about how her son had been cheated out of his inheritance by his uncle. Set, not recognizing Isis in disguise, was outraged by this injustice and declared that obviously the son's claim should be honored and the uncle punished. Only after he had proclaimed this judgment did Isis reveal herself, using Set's own words against him to demonstrate that even he acknowledged the principle that Horus's claim was righteous. Set was furious at being tricked, but he couldn't take back what he had said in front of the assembled gods. On another occasion, Isis actually harpooned Set while he was locked in combat with Horus, the two of them fighting in the form of hippopotamuses in the Nile River. But her aim failed, or perhaps her resolve wavered at the last moment because she struck Horus instead of Set. Horus, enraged by this accidental betrayal, emerged from the water and cut off his mother's head in a fit of fury. This shocking act of violence against his own mother demonstrated that even the righteous could become savage. Even Horus could be consumed by rage that violated every principle of proper conduct. Thoth intervened and healed Isis, replacing her severed head with the head of a cow, which is why Isis is sometimes depicted with cow horns in later iconography, a visual reminder of this terrible moment when the conflict between order and chaos became so intense that even family bonds were temporarily destroyed. The 80-year struggle involved not just legal arguments and courtroom drama, but also physical contests and battles, and even deeply disturbing sexual violence. Set at one point attempted to rape Horus, trying to humiliate his nephew and establish dominance through sexual assault. The attack was meant to prove Set's strength and Horus's weakness, to demonstrate that Set was the more powerful male and therefore deserved to rule. But Horus, warned by Isis, caught Set's semen in his hands rather than letting it enter his body. Isis then took Horus's semen and placed it on lettuce that grew in Set's garden, lettuce that Set ate without realizing it had been tampered with. When the gods assembled to judge between Horus and Set again, the question arose of who had dominated whom sexually, because in Egyptian thought sexual dominance correlated with political authority. Set boasted that he had penetrated Horus and therefore proved his superiority. But when the gods called upon the semen to reveal where it was, Set's semen answered from the marshes where Isis had thrown it, while Horus's semen answered from inside Set's body. Set had been made symbolically pregnant with his nephew's seed, had been feminized and dominated in the very act he thought proved his supremacy. The gods were convinced by this that Horus was the rightful victor, that he possessed the strength and cunning necessary to rule. Through all these contests and trials and battles, Isis remained Horus's most important ally and strategist. She taught him magic that could counter Set's strength. She devised the stratagems that turned Set's violence against him. She refused to let the tribunal ignore Horus's legitimate claim, no matter how much Ra favored Set. She was relentless and tireless and absolutely committed to seeing justice done, to seeing her husband avenged and her son placed on the throne that was rightfully his. Without Isis's magic and cunning, Horus would almost certainly have lost to Set's superior strength and experience. But with his mother fighting alongside him, wielding magic that could outwit brute force, Horus finally prevailed. The final judgment went to Horus. He was crowned as the rightful king of Egypt, lord of the living as his father Osiris had become lord of the dead. Set was punished for his crimes, though the exact nature of his punishment varies by source. In some versions he was forced to carry Osiris's body on his back for all eternity. In others he was bound and made to serve the gods he had tried to supplant. In still others he was sent back to the desert margins where he belonged, allowed to retain his role as defender against external chaos but forbidden from ever again threatening the ordered world from within. But the story of Isis and Set doesn't end with Horus's victory. Their opposition continued to define Egyptian thought about order and chaos, about the eternal struggle between Ma'at and Isfet, between civilization and wilderness, between the cultivated valley and the barren desert. Set remained dangerous and necessary, the god of violence that could defend or destroy depending on how it was directed. Isis remained the supreme magician and protector, the goddess whose cunning and power could defeat even the strongest opponents, whose love for her family and commitment to justice were powerful enough to reverse death itself and defeat chaos. What's remarkable about the conflict between Isis and Set is how it reveals Egyptian thought about power and how it should be exercised. Set possessed raw strength and violence, the ability to dominate through force. He was stronger than Osiris, which is why he could murder him. He was probably stronger than Horus physically, which is why their conflict dragged on for so long and involved so many different types of contests. But Set's strength wasn't enough to legitimize his rule, because strength alone doesn't create rightness. Power without justice is tyranny. Violence without law is chaos. Isis, by contrast, possessed a different kind of power, one based on knowledge and magic and strategic thinking. She couldn't match Set's physical strength, but she didn't need to, because she understood deeper principles that governed reality itself. She knew the true names and the secret spells. She could transform herself into different forms, could devise strategies that turned opponents' strengths into weaknesses, could outwit those who thought themselves invincible. Her power was more subtle, but ultimately more fundamental than Set's violence, because she understood and could manipulate the very forces that determined what was possible and what was real. The Egyptians told and retold this story throughout their history because it addressed something essential about how they wanted to understand the world. They lived surrounded by threats, by desert and foreign invasions, and the constant possibility that the Nile might fail and civilization would collapse back into chaos. Set represented all these threats, all the violence and disorder that constantly pressed against the boundaries of Ma'at. But they also believed that intelligence and magic and devotion to justice could prevail against these threats, that cunning like Isis's could defeat strength like Set's. That order could be maintained not just through force but through wisdom and proper conduct, and the magic that came from understanding the deep structures of reality. Isis became one of the most widely worshipped deities in ancient Egypt, and eventually throughout the entire Mediterranean world, precisely because her story offered hope that felt realistic rather than naive. She didn't defeat Set by being stronger than him. She defeated him by being smarter, more determined, more magical, more committed to justice and the proper order of things. She suffered terribly, losing her husband to murder and raising her son in hiding and facing constant danger from a powerful enemy who wanted to kill her and her child. But she never gave up, never accepted that Set's crime should go unpunished, never stopped fighting for what was right, even when the odds seemed overwhelming. This is why pregnant women called on Isis for protection, why mothers invoked her when their children were sick or in danger, why anyone facing powerful enemies appealed to her magic and her patronage. Because Isis had faced the most powerful enemy imaginable, had been threatened and hunted and struck down, and she had still found ways to resist and ultimately to prevail. She offered not a promise that life would be easy, or that the righteous would never suffer, but rather a promise that even in the face of terrible suffering and overwhelming power, cunning and magic and commitment to justice could find a way forward. The opposition between Isis and Set structured how Egyptians thought about their entire world. The fertile Nile Valley was Osiris's body and Isis's domain, the place where order and cultivation and civilization flourished. The surrounding desert was Set's realm, dangerous and hostile, but also necessary as a barrier against foreign threats. The tension between them was creative rather than simply destructive, because it was through their conflict that proper order was established and maintained. Set's violence was contained by Isis's magic. Isis's magic was tested and proven by Set's opposition. The world existed in the dynamic balance between these opposing forces, neither one able to completely triumph over the other, both necessary for creation to continue. Now we come to Nephthys, and this is where the story becomes even more layered with complexity and contradiction and the kind of nuanced relationships that the Egyptians excelled at preserving without trying to force them into simple categories. Nephthys was born on the fifth and final of those epigomenal days that Thoth had created from moonlight, the last child of Nut and Geb to enter the world before Ra's curse could take effect again. Her name in Egyptian, Nebt-Het, means Lady of the House, or Lady of the Enclosure, which sounds domestic and contained until you understand that the house she ruled over was the house of death itself, the enclosure of the tomb, the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. She was married to Set, her brother, just as Isis was married to Osiris, creating two divine couples who should have maintained balance and harmony, but instead became locked in a conflict that would define Egyptian mythology for millennia. Nephthys and Set together represented the desert margins, the liminal spaces, the boundaries where order met chaos, and neither could claim complete dominance. But unlike Set, who embodied violence and disruption and the constant threat of chaos overwhelming order, Nephthys represented something far more ambiguous and far more essential to Egyptian thought about death and transformation. She was the goddess of mourning, yes, but not in a passive sense of helpless grief. She was the goddess who guided souls through the dangerous transition from life to death, who stood at the threshold between worlds and helped the deceased navigate that terrifying passage. She was darkness to Isis's light, night to her sister's day, death to her sister's birth, yet the two of them were inseparable in Egyptian religious practice and thought. You could not have one without the other. Birth and death, light and darkness, day and night, these opposing forces required each other to create the completeness that the Egyptians called wholeness. The pyramid texts, those ancient funerary inscriptions carved into the burial chambers of Old Kingdom pharaohs, speak of Isis and Nephthys in paired phrases that reveal how the Egyptians understood their relationship. Ascend and descend. Descend with Nephthys, sink into darkness with the night bark. Ascend and descend, ascend with Isis, rise with the day bark. The soul of the deceased travelled with both sisters, descending into death with Nephthys and ascending into renewed life with Isis, both journeys equally necessary, both goddesses equally essential to the transformation that death required. But Nephthys's story contains a secret, a transgression that parallels her husband Set's murder of Osiris and perhaps even helped motivate it. According to traditions preserved by Greek writers like Plutarch, who studied Egyptian religion extensively, Nephthys desired a child with an intensity that consumed her. She was married to Set, the god of violence and chaos and the barren desert, and their union produced no offspring. Set was sterile or perhaps simply unwilling to create life, focused as he was on destruction rather than generation. Nephthys watched her sister Isis with Osiris, watched them rule Egypt in harmony and prosperity, watched Isis radiate the fulfilled joy of a woman who had everything including the promise of children to come, and Nephthys felt something dark and desperate growing within her. So Nephthys did something that would have consequences far beyond anything she could have imagined. She disguised herself as Isis, using magic or simply taking advantage of a moment when the light was dim and appearances could deceive. Some versions suggest she wore Isis's clothing and perfume, transforming herself so completely that even Osiris couldn't tell the difference. She went to Osiris in this disguise, and he, believing she was his wife, made love to her. From this single encounter, Nephthys became pregnant with Anubis, the jackal-headed god who would become lord of mummification and guardian of the dead. When Nephthys gave birth to Anubis, she faced an impossible situation. If Set discovered that she had borne a child and that the child was not his but Osiris's, his rage would be apocalyptic. So she did what she felt she had to do, as terrible as it was. She abandoned the infant Anubis in the wilderness, exposing him to die so that Set would never know what she had done. But Isis, who had discovered her sister's deception and the existence of the child, went searching for the abandoned infant. Isis found Anubis and adopted him, raising him as her own son, alongside the legitimate child she would later bear with Osiris, treating Nephthys's son with the same love and care she would give to Horus. This act of mercy from Isis toward her sister who had betrayed her, who had slept with her husband through deception, reveals something profound about how the Egyptians understood familial bonds and forgiveness and the complexity of divine relationships. Isis could have been furious, could have punished Nephthys, could have abandoned Anubis to his fate. Instead, she rescued the child and raised him, and Anubis became one of her most loyal companions, the god who would assist in every mummification and stand guard over every tomb and help judge every soul in the afterlife. Isis transformed her sister's transgression into something generative, taking betrayal and making it into family, creating loyalty from abandonment. But Set eventually learned the truth, and his response was exactly what Nephthys had feared. Some scholars believe that this discovery, this knowledge that his wife had conceived a child with his brother through deception, was what finally pushed Set to murder Osiris. Set's violence toward Osiris wasn't just political ambition or jealousy over the throne. It was personal betrayal, sexual humiliation, the rage of a husband who discovered he had been cuckolded by his own brother. This doesn't justify the murder, doesn't make Set's crime any less catastrophic for cosmic order. But it adds layers of motivation, makes the violence feel less like arbitrary chaos and more like the culmination of tangled family relationships and suppressed rage finally exploding into action that would shatter the world. When Osiris was murdered and his body scattered across Egypt, Nephthys faced a choice. She could remain with Set, her husband, the one who had just committed the ultimate crime against Ma'at and seized the throne through violence. Or she could abandon him and join her sister Isis in trying to restore what Set had destroyed. Nephthys chose Isis. She left Set and joined her sister in the long search for Osiris's scattered pieces, travelling across Egypt as a mourner and helper and companion in grief. The two sisters together, Isis and Nephthys, became the archetypal image of mourning in Egyptian culture. Every funeral reenacted their search for Osiris. Every tomb painting showed them standing at the head and foot of the deceased, protecting and mourning and helping to transform death into eternal life. This abandonment of Set to help Isis reveals something crucial about Nephthys's character and her role in Egyptian mythology. She was Set's wife and therefore associated with chaos and the desert margins, but she was not loyal to chaos itself. When Set violated Ma'at so fundamentally that the ordered world was threatened, Nephthys aligned herself with order, with her sister, with the attempt to restore what had been destroyed. She understood that some violations were too great to be accepted even by those who lived at the boundaries of order. Set had crossed a line that even the goddess of darkness and death could not follow him across. The two sisters together performed the rituals that preserved Osiris's body, that mummified him and spoke the spells that would allow him to transform from murdered king into eternal lord of the afterlife. They sang the lamentations that became the template for every funeral song Egypt would ever know. Their voices raised in ritual mourning created a sacred space where death could be transformed into something else, where endings could become transitions rather than finalities. Nephthys brought her expertise with boundaries and thresholds, her understanding of the passage between life and death, her knowledge of how to guide souls through the dangerous journey they had to make. And then Isis became pregnant with Horus through her act of magic with Osiris's preserved corpse, and once again Nephthys made a choice. She stayed with her sister, helping to protect Isis during the pregnancy, helping her flee into the marshes of the delta when Set learned that Osiris's heir had been conceived and began hunting for them both. Nephthys could have returned to Set at this point, could have claimed she had only been helping with Osiris's funeral out of familial duty and was now ready to resume her place as Set's wife. But she didn't. She followed Isis into exile and danger, abandoning whatever safety she might have claimed through her marriage to Set in order to help protect the child who represented the possibility of restored order and legitimate kingship. When Horus was born in the papyrus thickets, when Isis gave birth to the child who would one day challenge Set and reclaim the throne, Nephthys was there. The pyramid texts are explicit about this, calling Isis the birth mother of Horus, but calling Nephthys the nursing mother, the one who helped feed and raise and protect the divine infant. This wasn't just honorary language or poetic parallelism. Nephthys actually served as Horus's second mother, as essential to his survival as Isis herself, sharing the dangerous work of raising a child in hiding while being hunted by the most violent god in the Egyptian pantheon. Imagine what those years in the marshes must have been like for the two sisters and the infant god. They lived hidden among the reeds and papyrus, far from any city or temple or place where they might have found protection and resources. Isis had to disguise herself and go into nearby villages to beg for food, pretending to be an ordinary widow with a child, rather than revealing her divine nature. Nephthys stayed with Horus, keeping him hidden and safe, singing to him perhaps the same mourning songs she had sung over his father's body, lullabies that acknowledged death and danger while promising protection and eventual triumph. There are stories about Nephthys's protective fury during this time, descriptions of her as fierce and dangerous, capable of incinerating Set's agents with her fiery breath when they came too close to discovering where Horus was hidden. The goddess of death and mourning could become a goddess of destruction when those under her protection were threatened. She wielded darkness as a weapon, concealment as a shield, using everything she understood about boundaries and thresholds to keep Horus safe from those who would kill him before he could grow strong enough to challenge Set's illegitimate rule. The most famous story from this period of hiding involves the scorpion that stung young Horus, nearly killing him while Isis was away begging for food. When Isis returned and found her son dying, she screamed with such intensity that Ra's solar bark stopped its journey across the sky. The entire cosmos paused while Isis grieved, and Nephthys would have been there, would have witnessed her sister's anguish, would have helped perform the magic that called Thoth down from the heavens to assist in drawing the poison from Horus's body and restoring him to life. This moment, when Horus came so close to dying from something as small as a scorpion sting, must have terrified both sisters. All their efforts to protect him from Set could be undone by a simple accident, a moment of inattention, the ordinary dangers that threaten all children, whether divine or human. But they succeeded in keeping him alive, in raising him through infancy and childhood into a young god strong enough to begin learning the skills he would need to challenge Set. Nephthys taught Horus about boundaries and thresholds, about the liminal spaces where different worlds meet and how to navigate them safely. She taught him about death and what lies beyond it, preparing him for the reality that challenging Set might mean facing death himself. She taught him that endings could be transformed into new beginnings, that death was not the final word on any story if you had magic and determination and the will to transform catastrophe into rebirth. Isis taught Horus magic and strategy, the cunning and power he would need to match Set's strength and violence. But Nephthys taught him something equally important, an understanding of the dark spaces and the fearful passages, and the courage required to face death and not be destroyed by it. Both mothers were essential. Both contributed to making Horus into the god who could eventually face Set and reclaim the throne that should have been his from the moment Osiris died. When Horus finally came of age and the long conflict with Set began, Nephthys continued to support her sister and nephew against her husband. During the 80 years that the struggle dragged on, during all the contests and trials and battles and legal proceedings before the assembled gods, Nephthys stood with Isis and Horus rather than with Set. Her loyalty to the restoration of Ma'at superseded her loyalty to her marriage, to the god who had once been her partner but who had violated cosmic order so fundamentally that he could no longer command her allegiance. The texts describe Nephthys reminding Horus of the danger she had undertaken for his sake, the risks she had faced by abandoning Set to protect him, the sacrifices she had made to ensure he survived to claim his inheritance. She speaks of leaving the son of Set to care for Horus instead, a cryptic phrase that might refer to Anubis, her own son by Osiris, who she had abandoned as an infant, but who Isis had raised, and who now served the cause of order against chaos. Nephthys had given up everything, her marriage, her safety, her place in Set's realm, to help raise the child who would eventually overthrow the god she had once been bound to. After Horus's eventual victory, after the divine tribunal finally ruled in his favor and he was crowned as the rightful king of Egypt, Nephthys's role became fully established. She joined Isis as one of the great funerary goddesses, the two sisters together presiding over every death and every funeral and every soul's passage into the afterlife. They appear together on tomb walls and sarcophagi, standing at the head and foot of the deceased, spreading their wings in protection, mourning and guarding, and helping to transform the dead into eternal spirits who would dwell in Osiris's kingdom. At the great temple complex at Abydos, where Osiris's cult was centered, two priestesses were chosen to perform the lamentations of Isis and Nephthys, an elaborate ritual that reenacted the sisters' search for Osiris's body and their mourning over his death. These lamentations were performed annually, singing the ancient songs of grief and transformation, reminding everyone who witnessed them that death could be met with love and magic and the determination to restore what had been destroyed. The two goddesses together represented the complete response to death, Isis as the one who could reverse it through magic and Nephthys as the one who could guide souls through it safely. Nephthys was called Queen of the Embalmer's Shop in Memphis, honored as the patron of those who prepared bodies for the afterlife journey. Every embalmer worked under her protection and guidance, learning the rituals she had first performed on Osiris's scattered body, preserving the dead so they could be transformed rather than simply lost to decay. She was associated with Anubis, her son, the jackal-headed god who supervised every mummification and stood guard at cemetery gates. Together they ensured that death became a passage rather than an ending, that the deceased were protected and prepared and guided into their new existence in the realm of the dead. What makes Nephthys so fascinating is her position between opposing forces, her refusal to be categorized simply as good or evil, order or chaos. She was married to Set but loyal to Ma'at. She deceived Osiris but helped restore him after his murder. She abandoned her own infant son but helped raise her sister's child. She was the goddess of death and darkness and mourning, yet her role was fundamentally protective and nurturing, helping souls pass safely through the most dangerous transition they would ever face. She embodied contradictions that the Egyptians refused to resolve into simple categories, accepting that a goddess could be both dark and helpful, both associated with chaos and committed to order, both Set's wife and Isis's most loyal ally. Her relationship with Horus specifically, as his nursing mother and protector during his vulnerable childhood, gave her a special place in Egyptian royal ideology. Every pharaoh was understood as the living Horus, the god incarnate ruling over Egypt with divine authority. But every pharaoh had also been an infant once, vulnerable and dependent, needing protection through the dangerous passage from childhood to mature kingship. Nephthys represented that protection, the dark mother who guarded the king through his most vulnerable moments, who taught him about boundaries and transitions and the courage needed to face danger and death without being destroyed. The Ramesside pharaohs particularly revered Mother Nephthys, dedicating altars to her at Karnak and Luxor and invoking her protection in their monumental inscriptions. They understood that kingship required not just the bright magic and strategic cunning that Isis represented, but also the darker wisdom that Nephthys embodied, the knowledge of how to navigate liminal spaces and dangerous passages, and the realm where death waited for everyone, including gods and kings. When you think about Nephthys and Horus together, you're thinking about the relationship between vulnerability and protection, between the child who needs sheltering and the dark mother who provides it even at great cost to herself. You're thinking about loyalty that transcends marriage and legal bonds, about choosing to support what is right even when it means abandoning what you're supposed to be tied to. You're thinking about how the goddess of death became essential to life, how the one who dwells in darkness helps the light survive and grow strong enough to reclaim its rightful place. Nephthys chose to protect Horus over remaining with Set. She chose to help restore Ma'at, even though it meant aligning herself against her own husband. She chose to become a second mother to the child who would overthrow the god she had been married to, understanding that some things matter more than marriage vows or personal loyalty, that cosmic order and justice and the proper succession of legitimate kingship were worth any sacrifice, including the abandonment of everything she had been before. This is what made Nephthys essential rather than simply tragic, what elevated her from a goddess of mourning into one of Egypt's most important protective deities. The two sisters together, Isis and Nephthys, represent the complete response to death and injustice and the violation of cosmic order. Isis represents active resistance through magic and cunning, the refusal to accept death as final, the determination to restore what has been destroyed through whatever means necessary. Nephthys represents the wisdom to navigate darkness safely, the courage to stand at boundaries and thresholds without being consumed by them, the protective love that shelters vulnerability until it can become strength. Together they raised Horus. Together they restored Osiris. Together they presided over every Egyptian funeral and every soul's passage into eternal life. And together they demonstrated that even the most catastrophic violations of order could be met with love and magic and determination, powerful enough to transform death itself into renewal. Now we must speak of Ra and Thoth, two gods whose relationship reveals something profound about how the Egyptians understood power and wisdom and the delicate balance between raw divine authority and the intelligence required to wield that authority without destroying everything it touches. Ra was the sun god, the supreme creator in many Egyptian traditions, the burning eye that crossed the sky each day bringing light and life and order to the world. Thoth was the moon god, the divine scribe, the inventor of writing and language and magic, the mediator who stood between opposing forces and found solutions when conflict threatened to tear creation apart. Together they represented day and night, power and wisdom, action and reflection, two principles that needed each other desperately, even when they didn't always agree. Ra's story begins at the very foundation of creation itself, though his relationship with Atum and the Heliopolitan creation myth we've already discussed is complex and sometimes contradictory. In some traditions, Ra and Atum are simply different names for the same deity, the self-created one who emerged from the primordial waters and began the process of generating all other gods and forms of existence. In other traditions, Ra is a distinct deity who came to prominence later, absorbing Atum's role and becoming the supreme solar deity whose daily journey across the sky sustained all life. What matters for our purposes is understanding Ra as the Egyptians of the New Kingdom and later periods understood him, as the aging but still immensely powerful sun god who ruled over creation from his solar bark, travelling across the sky by day and through the dangerous underworld by night. Ra was depicted as a man with the head of a falcon, crowned with the solar disk and the Uraeus serpent, or sometimes as the sun disk itself, radiating light and heat across the world. He represented the life-giving power of the sun that made crops grow, and the Nile flood, and all of Egypt's abundance possible. But he also represented the sun's destructive potential, the burning heat that could scorch fields to dust and kill anyone foolish enough to challenge him. Ra's power was absolute in its sphere, undeniable and overwhelming, the foundation upon which all other existence rested. Without the sun's daily journey, there could be no life, no time, no ordered world at all. Everything depended on Ra continuing his eternal voyage across the heavens. But absolute power, even divine power, comes with profound limitations. Ra was immensely strong, but he wasn't infinitely wise. He was capable of creating worlds, but also capable of making mistakes, of acting impulsively, of letting his emotions override his judgment in ways that threatened the very order he was supposed to maintain. This is where Thoth became absolutely essential, because Thoth possessed something that Ra sometimes lacked despite all his power: the intelligence and creativity and diplomatic skill to solve problems that couldn't be solved through force alone. Thoth was depicted either as a man with the head of an ibis, that curved-beaked bird whose shape resembled the crescent moon, or as a baboon, one of those clever primates whose intelligence and manual dexterity made them seem almost human in their capabilities. The ibis form connected Thoth to writing and scholarship, because scribes saw in the ibis's curved beak the shape of the hieratic script they used daily. The baboon form connected him to the moon and to the dawn, because baboons were observed greeting the rising sun with vocalizations that seemed like worship. Both forms emphasized Thoth's role as a mediator between different realms, a translator who could take divine knowledge and make it accessible, who could take complex problems and find elegant solutions. The Egyptians called Thoth the heart and tongue of Ra, a phrase that reveals how intimately connected these two gods were despite their differences. The heart in Egyptian thought was the seat of intelligence and emotion and character, the organ that would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at in the afterlife to determine whether a soul deserved eternal life. The tongue was the organ of speech and command, the tool through which thought became action and intention became reality. To call Thoth Ra's heart and tongue was to say that Thoth provided the intelligence and the eloquence that Ra's power required to be exercised properly. Ra might have had the strength to command the cosmos, but Thoth provided the wisdom to know what commands should be given and the words to express them in ways that would be effective rather than destructive. Each night when Ra's solar bark descended below the western horizon, when the sun appeared to die and enter the realm of darkness and danger, Thoth was there in the boat alongside him. The journey through the underworld was fraught with perils, with demons and obstacles, and above all with Apophis, the great serpent of chaos who tried each night to swallow Ra and prevent the dawn from ever coming. Set stood at the prow of the bark, wielding his violence against Apophis, fighting chaos with barely controlled chaos, his strength essential for defending the sun against the ultimate threat to creation. But Thoth stood beside Ra as navigator and advisor, using his knowledge of magic and his understanding of the underworld's geography to guide the Barquet safely through the 12 hours of night, ensuring that Ra would emerge renewed at dawn to begin another day. This nightly journey revealed the fundamental pattern of their relationship. Ra provided the power and the authority, the divine force that sustained creation. Thoth provided the knowledge and strategy, the intelligence that made that power effective rather than self-defeating. Neither could succeed without the other. Ra, without Thoth, would be raw strength without direction, liable to destroy what he meant to protect. Thoth without Ra would be pure intellect with no power to implement his solutions, wisdom that couldn't affect the world in meaningful ways. Together they maintained the balance that allowed creation to continue, day after day, night after night, through endless cycles of death and renewal. But their relationship wasn't always harmonious, and the tensions between them reveal important truths about power and wisdom, and how they sometimes come into conflict even when both are necessary for maintaining order. Ra was proud, intensely proud in the way that beings with absolute power often are. He was accustomed to being obeyed without question, to having his will shape reality simply because he willed it. This pride made him vulnerable to manipulation and also made him dangerous when he felt his authority was being challenged or undermined. Several myths illustrate this dangerous pride and show how Thoth had to use all his cleverness to work around Ra's ego while still accomplishing what needed to be done. The story of Nut's curse is perhaps the best example of how Ra's pride could create problems that only Thoth's ingenuity could solve. When Ra learned the prophecy that one of Nut's children would eventually supplant him as ruler of the gods, he responded with a curse born of fear and wounded pride rather than wisdom. He declared that Nut would not be able to give birth on any day of the year, condemning her to eternal pregnancy and ensuring that the children who might threaten him would never enter the world. This was tyranny, masquerading as divine authority, fear disguising itself as power, a response that violated Ma'at even while claiming to defend cosmic order. Ra was the supreme god. His word was law, and his curse seemed absolute and unbreakable. But Thoth understood something that Ra in his pride had overlooked. Ra's curse covered every day of the year, as the year was currently constituted. But what if the year itself could be changed? What if days could be created that existed outside Ra's original prohibition? This is the kind of lateral thinking that characterized Thoth's approach to problems, finding solutions that technically satisfied the letter of divine law while completely circumventing its spirit. Thoth went to Khonsu, the moon god who shone nearly as brightly as Ra himself in those days before Thoth's scheme diminished his light. Thoth challenged Khonsu to games of chance, probably Senet, that board game that Egyptians played both for entertainment and for divination and ritual purposes. Game after game they played throughout the night, and with each game Khonsu lost, surrendering portions of his moonlight to Thoth as payment for his gambling debts. By the time Thoth was finished, he had won enough moonlight to create 5 additional days, 5 days that would be added to the end of the 360-day year, and that existed outside the boundaries of Ra's curse. On these 5 epigomenal days, Nut gave birth to her children Osiris, Horus the Elder, Set, Isis, and Nephthys. The gods who would shape Egyptian mythology and religion for millennia were born because Thoth found a way to outwit Ra's curse without directly defying it, because intelligence and creativity proved capable of circumventing even absolute divine authority when that authority was exercised unwisely. Ra presumably was not pleased when he discovered what Thoth had done, when he learned that his curse had been broken through cleverness rather than power. But what could he do? Thoth hadn't violated Ra's decree, hadn't broken the curse through force or open rebellion. He had simply created a situation where the curse no longer applied, had changed the rules of the game so that Ra's prohibition became meaningless. This pattern repeated throughout Egyptian mythology. Ra would act impulsively or tyrannically, exercising his power in ways that created problems or violated Ma'at. And Thoth would find solutions that preserved Ra's dignity and authority while undoing the damage that Ra's impulsive actions had caused. When Tefnut fled to Nubia in rage, and Egypt suffered from drought because the goddess of moisture had abandoned the land, it was Ra who sent Thoth along with Shu to persuade her to return. Ra himself couldn't go, couldn't apologize or negotiate, because his pride wouldn't allow him to admit that he might have been wrong or that he needed anyone. But Thoth could go as Ra's representative, could use stories and wisdom and persuasion to accomplish what Ra's command and authority could never achieve. Thoth and Shu disguised themselves as baboons and travelled into the wilderness where Tefnut raged as a bloodthirsty lioness covered in the blood of her hunting. They approached her carefully, respectfully, not with commands or threats, but with conversation and narrative. Thoth told Tefnut stories about Egypt and how it suffered without her, reminded her of her importance and her essential role in maintaining Ma'at, spoke to her as one divine being to another rather than as a subject addressing a superior. Gradually, her rage cooled and she agreed to return, transforming from the fierce destroyer back into the gentle goddess of moisture as she approached Egypt's borders. This diplomatic mission revealed Thoth's essential role as mediator and problem solver in the divine court. He possessed the emotional intelligence and rhetorical skill that Ra lacked, the ability to understand others' perspectives and craft arguments that would persuade rather than simply command. Ra's style of leadership was authoritarian and absolute, demanding obedience through overwhelming power. Thoth's style was collaborative and persuasive, seeking consensus and finding solutions that satisfied everyone's needs, even when those needs seemed initially incompatible. The relationship between them became even more complex as Ra aged. Unlike humans, Egyptian gods weren't necessarily immortal in the sense of being unchanging and eternal. They could age, could become weaker, could even in some sense die, though their deaths were usually followed by transformations rather than simple endings. Ra aged visibly over time according to several myths, his body growing old and feeble even as his divine power remained immense. He was depicted in some texts as drooling and shaking, an ancient being who had ruled for so long that his very body was breaking down under the weight of millennia. This aging created vulnerabilities that Ra's pride wouldn't let him acknowledge. The story of Isis tricking Ra into revealing his true name illustrates this perfectly. Ra, in his old age, began to drool, his divine saliva falling to earth and mixing with dust. Isis collected some of this mixture and fashioned from it a serpent, a creature that had never existed before, and that Ra therefore had no natural defense against. She placed the serpent on Ra's daily path, and when the sun god passed by, it struck him, injecting venom that caused Ra agony beyond anything he had ever experienced. Ra screamed for help, and all the gods came running, but none of them could heal him. Finally, Isis appeared offering to cure him with her magic, but only if he would tell her his true name, that secret name that contained the essence of his power and identity. Ra tried to bargain, listing all his known names and titles and epithets, hundreds of names that described his various aspects and functions. But Isis wasn't fooled. She waited patiently, watching the venom work deeper into Ra's divine body, until finally the pain became unbearable and Ra whispered his true secret name into her ear where none of the other gods could hear. Immediately Isis drew out the poison and healed Ra, but the transaction was complete. She now possessed his true name and with it power that rivaled or exceeded his own. Ra had been forced by pain and desperation to surrender the ultimate source of his authority to a goddess young enough to be his granddaughter, all because his aging body had made him vulnerable to a threat he couldn't have imagined in his prime. This story reveals the tragedy of power that refuses to acknowledge its own limitations, divine authority that cannot adapt to changing circumstances or admit when it needs help. Thoth's role as Ra's advisor became even more crucial as the sun god aged. The texts speak of Thoth standing beside Ra on the solar bouquet, not just during the dangerous night journey but increasingly during the day as well, helping Ra maintain his authority and discharge his responsibilities even as his physical strength declined. Thoth became in some sense Ra's regent, the god who actually governed creation on Ra's behalf, while allowing Ra to maintain the appearance and dignity of supreme authority. This required tremendous diplomatic skill and loyalty, because Thoth could easily have seized power for himself given his knowledge and magical ability. But Thoth understood that cosmic order required Ra to remain in his position as sun god and supreme creator, that replacing Ra would cause more problems than it solved. Eventually, according to some myths, Ra became so exhausted by the burden of rulership that he decided to withdraw from the world entirely. He climbed onto the back of Nut, who had transformed into a celestial cow, and she lifted him into the highest heavens where he could rest and no longer be troubled by the conflicts and demands of governing creation. This withdrawal left a power vacuum that had to be filled, and Thoth played a crucial role in managing the transition, ensuring that kingship passed properly to the next generation of gods, and that cosmic order was maintained despite Ra's absence. But Thoth's relationship with Ra involved more than just solving practical problems and managing divine politics. Thoth was also the keeper of divine knowledge, the scribe who recorded everything that happened in heaven and earth, the god who understood the deep patterns and principles that governed reality itself. He wrote books containing all this knowledge, texts that were attributed to his authorship and that supposedly contained secrets about magic and the afterlife and the true nature of existence. These books of Thoth became legendary, representing both the promise of ultimate knowledge and the danger of mortals seeking wisdom that was meant for gods alone. The myth of Prince Neferkaptah illustrates the dangerous relationship between human ambition and divine knowledge. Neferkaptah was a prince of Egypt who became obsessed with finding Thoth's book, the original text that supposedly contained all the gods' wisdom and all the secrets of the universe. Despite warnings from priests and from his own family, Neferkaptah pursued the book relentlessly, eventually discovering it hidden in a chest at the bottom of a river, guarded by magical creatures and serpents. He fought through all the guardians and claimed the book, reading it and gaining tremendous magical knowledge and power. But this theft of divine knowledge came with terrible consequences. Thoth, discovering what Neferkaptah had done, consulted with Ra about how to punish this violation. Ra agreed that the prince had overstepped the boundaries that separated human from divine mortal knowledge from godly wisdom. The punishment they devised was cruel and comprehensive. Neferkaptah's wife and son both died tragically, and eventually Neferkaptah himself perished, his ka condemned to guard the very book he had stolen, unable to rest in the afterlife because he had violated the sacred boundary between mortal and divine knowledge. This myth reveals something important about Ra and Thoth's shared conviction that some knowledge must remain hidden from mortals, that the boundary between human understanding and divine wisdom is essential for maintaining cosmic order. Ra and Thoth disagreed on many things, had different approaches to power and authority and governance. But they agreed absolutely on this principle that humans must accept their mortality and their limitations, must not seek to become gods themselves through acquiring forbidden knowledge. Thoth protected his books not out of selfishness, but because allowing mortals access to that knowledge would destabilize the carefully maintained balance between human and divine realms. In the afterlife, Ra and Thoth continued their partnership in transformed ways. The sun's nightly journey through the underworld became the pattern that every soul would follow after death, descending into darkness with the setting sun, passing through trials and dangers, and emerging hopefully renewed with the dawn. Thoth played a crucial role in this underworld journey, serving as the divine scribe who recorded the results of the weighing of the heart ceremony in Osiris's Hall of Judgment. when a soul stood before Osiris and had their heart weighed against the feather of Ma'at, when Anubis conducted the weighing and Ammit the devourer waited to consume hearts that were found unworthy, it was Thoth who wrote down the results, whose record became the official determination of whether that soul would enter eternal life or be destroyed forever. This role as divine scribe and recorder gave Thoth tremendous power in the afterlife, power that in some ways exceeded even Osiris's authority as Lord of the Dead. Osiris presided over the judgment and made the final pronouncement, but Thoth's record was what made that judgment official and permanent. Nothing happened in the afterlife that Thoth didn't write down. No soul passed into eternal life without Thoth recording their worthiness. No transformation or blessing or punishment occurred without being documented in Thoth's books. He was the divine memory of creation itself, ensuring that nothing was forgotten and that justice was maintained according to Ma'at rather than according to whim or favoritism. Ra himself appeared in the underworld during his nightly journey, bringing light and life temporarily to that realm of darkness and death. The deceased prayed for Ra's Ba to visit them, to bring the solar radiance that would energize their cars and allow them to continue existing in the realm of the dead. Thoth guided Ra safely through the underworld's dangers, just as he had guided him through the dangerous political situations and divine conflicts that arose in the world of the living. Their partnership extended beyond death, became eternal, became one of the fundamental patterns that structured Egyptian thought about existence in all its dimensions. What makes Ra and Thoth's relationship so fascinating and so important for understanding Egyptian thought is how it represents the necessary tension between power and wisdom, between the authority that can command reality to change and the intelligence that knows what changes should be commanded. Ra without Thoth would be a tyrant, overwhelming and destructive despite his good intentions. Thoth without Ra would be ineffectual, full of brilliant ideas that could never be implemented because he lacked the raw power to make them real. Together they created something greater than either could achieve alone, a partnership that sustained cosmic order through combining complementary strengths and compensating for each other's weaknesses. The Egyptians understood that creation required both divine principles working in harmony. They understood that the sun's burning power needed the moon's cooling reflection, that day's clarity needed night's restoration, that command needed to be balanced by counsel. In temples throughout Egypt, priests served both Ra and Thoth, acknowledging their interconnection and their mutual necessity. Scribes in particular revered Thoth as their patron, while also acknowledging Ra's supreme authority, understanding that writing and knowledge derived their ultimate importance from serving the sun god's cosmic order. When pharaohs ruled Egypt, they embodied both principles in their governance. They were the living Horus, yes, but they were also expected to combine Ra's authority with Thoth's wisdom, to rule with both power and intelligence, to command with both force and eloquence. The best pharaohs were those who could maintain this balance, who knew when to exercise absolute authority like Ra and when to listen to counselors and find diplomatic solutions like Thoth. The worst pharaohs were those who possessed only one principle without the other, who had power without wisdom or wisdom without the will to implement it effectively. In the eternal cycle of day and night, in the endless journey of the sun across the sky and through the underworld, in the balance between burning light and cool reflection, the Egyptians saw Ra and Thoth working together to sustain all existence. Every dawn was their renewed partnership. Every sunset was their descent together into dangerous realms where cooperation became the only path to survival. Every word written by every scribe was Thoth's gift made possible by Ra's continued journey, providing light to see by. Every decree issued by Pharaoh was Ra's authority expressed through Thoth's eloquence and wisdom. This is what made their relationship essential rather than simply interesting. what elevated it from a divine friendship into one of the fundamental structures holding reality together. Without both of them working in tandem despite their differences, despite the tensions between power and wisdom, despite Ra's pride and Thoth's occasional too-cleverness, creation itself would collapse back into the chaos from which it had emerged. The sun would fail to rise, words would lose their meaning, knowledge would become dangerous rather than illuminating, and Ma'at itself would be violated beyond any possibility of restoration. Now we come to Anubis and Ma'at, and here we encounter something that reveals the deepest truths about how the Egyptians understood death and justice and the possibility of eternal life. Anubis was the jackal-headed god of mummification and guardian of the dead, the one who stood watch over every tomb and presided over every embalming and guided every soul through the dangerous passage from life to death. Ma'at was both a goddess and a concept, the very principle of truth and order and balance that held the entire cosmos together, without which everything would collapse back into the primordial chaos of none. Together they formed the axis around which Egyptian beliefs about the afterlife revolved, the partnership between the guardian who protected the dead and the standard against which every soul would be measured. Anubis's story begins with a transgression and an abandonment that somehow transformed into one of the most important roles in all of Egyptian religion. He was born from Nephthys's deception of Osiris, conceived when Nephthys disguised herself as Isis and seduced her brother-in-law because she desperately wanted a child, but her husband, Set, was sterile or unwilling to create life. When Nephthys gave birth to Anubis, she faced an impossible situation. If Set discovered that she had borne Osiris's child, his rage would be apocalyptic and the infant would certainly be killed. So Nephthys did what she felt she had to do, as terrible as it was. She abandoned the newborn Anubis in the wilderness, exposing him to die so that Set would never learn of her betrayal. But Isis discovered the abandoned infant and went searching for him in the marshes and wild places where Nephthys had left him to his fate. Some versions say that dogs led Isis to where the baby lay crying, which is why dogs and jackals became sacred to Anubis and why he was depicted with a jackal's head. Isis found the child and adopted him, raising him as her own son with the same love and care she would later give to Horus. This act of mercy from Isis, taking in her sister's child even though that child was born from deception and betrayal, revealed something profound about divine compassion and the possibility of transforming transgression into something generative and protective. Anubis grew up under Isis's care, learning magic and the sacred arts from the goddess who possessed more Heka than any other deity except perhaps Thoth. He learned about death and transformation and the processes by which the physical body could be preserved so that the soul would have a vessel to return to in the afterlife. When Osiris was murdered by Set and his body scattered across Egypt, when Isis and Nephthys embarked on their desperate search to gather the pieces of the murdered god, Anubis was there to help them. He assisted in collecting Osiris's dismembered body parts, and then he performed the first mummification, inventing the techniques and rituals that would preserve Osiris's body and allow his transformation from murdered king into eternal lord of the dead. This first embalming established Anubis's role for all eternity. He became the patron god of embalmers, the divine presence invoked at every mummification, the protector who ensured that the sacred processes were performed correctly so that the deceased could be transformed rather than simply lost to decay. Every embalmer in Egypt worked under Anubis's guidance, wearing jackal masks during the mummification rituals to represent the god's presence, speaking the spells and performing the actions that Anubis had first performed on Osiris's body. The embalming tent where bodies were prepared for the afterlife was called the place of purification, or the good house, and it was understood as Anubis's domain, a sacred space where death was transformed through careful ritual and ancient knowledge into the first step toward eternal life. Anubis was depicted as a man with the head of a black jackal, or as a full jackal lying on a shrine, his black colouring representing both the colour of decomposition and the colour of the rich Nile silt that brought fertility and new life to Egypt each year. This dual symbolism was intentional and important. Black represented death but also rebirth, the end of one cycle and the beginning of another, decay that was necessary for new growth to emerge. Jackals were associated with cemeteries because they were seen roaming burial grounds at night, and the Egyptians transformed this potentially frightening association into something protective by making the jackal god the guardian of the dead rather than their despoiler. His role as guardian extended beyond the physical protection of tombs and bodies. Anubis was the psychopomp, the guide of souls through the dangerous journey from the world of the living into the realm of the dead. When someone died, their soul had to navigate through the underworld called the Duat, a terrifying landscape filled with demons and obstacles and gates guarded by creatures who would devour the unprepared. The journey required knowledge of spells and passwords and the proper responses to challenges that the deceased would face. The Book of the Dead, that collection of spells and instructions that the Egyptians placed in tombs to help the deceased navigate the afterlife, was essentially a guidebook for this journey that Anubis supervised. But Anubis's most crucial role, the function that made him absolutely central to Egyptian beliefs about death and judgment and the possibility of eternal life, was his position in the Hall of Two Truths where the weighing of the heart ceremony took place. This was the ultimate test that every soul had to pass, the moment when a lifetime's worth of actions and choices and moral character would be evaluated against the fundamental principle of cosmic order itself. The ceremony took place in Osiris's hall, with Osiris seated on his throne as judge and lord of the dead, but it was Anubis who conducted the actual weighing, who manipulated the scales and ensured that the process was carried out with perfect precision and absolute fairness. The deceased would stand before the assembly of 42 divine judges, each representing a different sin or transgression that the soul must deny having committed. The deceased would recite the negative confession, a litany of denials covering every possible violation of Ma'at. I have not killed, I have not stolen, I have not told lies, I have not committed adultery, I have not been angry without cause, I have not polluted the water. I have not been proud, I have not been avaricious. On and on the list went, covering every aspect of ethical conduct and ritual purity that the Egyptians considered essential to a life lived in harmony with Ma'at. But words alone weren't sufficient proof of a righteous life. The true test came when Anubis led the deceased to the great scales that stood in the centre of the hall. On one side of the scales, Anubis would place the deceased's heart, that organ which the Egyptians believed was the seat of intelligence and memory and moral character. The heart contained the record of everything the person had done, every choice they had made, every action they had taken throughout their entire life. It was heavy with the accumulated weight of their deeds, and that weight would now be measured against the ultimate standard of truth and justice. On the other side of the scales, Anubis placed a single feather. Not just any feather, but the feather of Ma'at, that ostrich plume that represented the goddess herself and everything she embodied. This feather was the physical manifestation of perfect truth, perfect justice, perfect balance, perfect order. It represented the ideal standard against which all moral conduct must be measured, the cosmic principle that determined whether a soul was worthy of eternal life or deserved to be destroyed forever. The weighing itself was a moment of absolute tension and perfect stillness. Anubis adjusted the scales with meticulous care, ensuring that the mechanism was perfectly balanced, and that no external force could influence the result. The deceased watched in terror and hope as their heart was weighed against the feather, as their entire life was reduced to this single measurement, this ultimate test of whether they had lived according to Ma'at or had violated the cosmic order through their actions and choices. If the heart balanced perfectly with the feather, if it was found to be neither heavier nor lighter than Ma'at itself, then the deceased had passed the test. Osiris would pronounce them justified or true of voice, and they would be welcomed into the field of reeds, that paradisiacal realm where the blessed dead dwelt forever in abundance and peace. They would be transformed into imperishable spirits who could move freely between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, who could receive offerings from their descendants and intercede on behalf of those still alive. But if the heart weighed more than the feather, if it was heavy with lies and violence and violations of Ma'at, then the consequences were absolute and terrifying. The heart would tip the scales, revealing the moral corruption of the deceased, proving that they were unworthy of eternal life. At that moment, Ammit would strike. Ammit was a composite creature, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, the devourer of the dead, who waited beside the scales for exactly this moment. She would seize the condemned heart and consume it entirely, and with the destruction of the heart, the person's entire existence would be obliterated. Not just death, but annihilation, the complete erasure of identity and consciousness and any possibility of continued existence. The Egyptians called this the second death, the death from which there was no resurrection, no transformation, no hope of renewal. This is where Ma'at's role becomes fully clear and fully terrifying in its implications. Ma'at wasn't just a goddess who happened to provide a convenient measuring tool for the weighing ceremony. She was the fundamental principle against which reality itself was measured, the standard that determined what was true and what was false, what was just and what was unjust, what deserved to continue existing and what deserved to be destroyed. She embodied the cosmic order that Ra had established at creation, and that all the gods worked constantly to maintain against the ever-present threat of chaos. Ma'at was depicted as a woman wearing an ostrich feather on her head, or sometimes as just the feather itself, that simple, elegant plume that somehow contained within it all the complexity of truth and justice and balance. She was the daughter of Ra, according to most traditions, created by the sun god to be the principle by which he governed creation, the standard against which all his decisions and decrees would be measured. Every pharaoh was expected to do Ma'at, to rule according to truth and justice and proper order, rather than according to whim or personal advantage. Every Egyptian was expected to live in harmony with Ma'at, to speak truth and act justly and maintain proper relationships with gods and humans and the natural world. But Ma'at was more than just an ethical code or a set of rules for proper behavior. She was the principle that held the entire cosmos together, that prevented creation from collapsing back into the chaos of none. When the sun rose each morning, when the Nile flooded on schedule, when the seasons followed their proper sequence, when the stars moved in their appointed paths across the sky, all of this was Ma'at functioning as she should. When droughts came or floods were too high or too low, when foreign armies invaded, when disease struck, when disorder of any kind threatened Egyptian society, this was Isfet, the opposite of Ma'at, chaos pressing in at the boundaries of order and threatening to overwhelm everything. The relationship between Anubis and Ma'at in the weighing ceremony therefore represented something far more significant than a simple test of individual morality. It represented the fundamental question of whether a particular soul was aligned with cosmic order or opposed to it, whether their existence contributed to maintaining Ma'at or threatened to increase Isfet. Anubis, as the conductor of the weighing ceremony, was acting as Ma'at's instrument, the one who determined whether each soul had lived according to the principle she embodied or had violated it through their actions and choices. This gave Anubis tremendous power and tremendous responsibility. He couldn't be bribed or deceived or influenced by appeals to mercy or compassion. The scales had to be absolutely accurate. The weighing had to be perfectly fair, because the entire structure of cosmic justice depended on this moment being conducted with perfect integrity. If Anubis allowed an unworthy heart to pass the test, if he permitted someone who had violated Ma'at to enter eternal life, then he would be threatening the cosmic order itself, allowing Isfet to infiltrate the realm of the blessed dead and potentially corrupt everything. But Anubis was also the god who had helped embalm Osiris, who had worked alongside Isis and Nephthys to transform the murdered god into the eternal lord of the afterlife. He understood better than anyone, except perhaps Osiris himself, what it meant to die and to be transformed through death into something that could exist eternally. He knew the fear that the deceased felt standing before the scales, the terror of having their entire life reduced to this single moment of judgment. He conducted the weighing with compassion as well as justice, with understanding as well as impartial fairness. The texts describe Anubis speaking to the deceased, guiding them through the process, explaining what was happening and what would happen next. He wasn't a cruel or indifferent judge, but a guardian who wanted the souls under his protection to succeed, who hoped that each heart would balance with the feather and each person would be found worthy of eternal life. But his compassion couldn't override his duty to Ma'at, couldn't allow him to falsify the results of the weighing or to pass judgment based on anything except the actual weight of the heart against the feather of truth. Thoth stood beside the scales during the weighing ceremony, recording the results with his scribal implements, documenting for eternity whether each soul passed or failed this ultimate test. His presence ensured that the results were official and permanent, that no one could later dispute what had happened or claim that they had been judged unfairly. The weighing of the heart became the official record of a person's moral worth, written in Thoth's books and preserved forever in the divine archives. Together, Anubis and Ma'at represented the partnership between the guardian who protects the dead and the standard that determines whether that protection extends into eternity or ends with annihilation. Anubis could guide souls through the dangerous underworld, could protect them from demons and obstacles, could ensure their bodies were properly preserved through mummification. But he couldn't save them from Ma'at's judgment. He couldn't make a heavy heart light or transform a life of lies and violence into one of truth and justice. The only way to pass the weighing ceremony was to have actually lived according to Ma'at during life, to have made choices and taken actions that were aligned with cosmic order rather than opposed to it. This is why the Egyptians placed such tremendous emphasis on ethical conduct and ritual purity during life. It wasn't just about following rules or avoiding punishment. It was about literally determining whether you would continue to exist after death or would be destroyed forever. The weighing ceremony made abstract questions about right and wrong into concrete matters of survival and annihilation. If you lied, if you stole, if you killed unjustly, if you polluted the water, if you were proud or cruel or dishonest, then your heart would be heavy with these violations and you would fail Ma'at's test. But if you lived truthfully and justly, if you gave bread to the hungry and water to the thirsty, if you spoke truth and acted with integrity, then your heart would be light enough to balance with the feather and you would be welcomed into eternal life. The relationship between Anubis and Ma'at extended beyond the weighing ceremony into every aspect of funerary practice and death ritual. When embalmers prepared bodies, they were working under Anubis's guidance to ensure that the deceased would have a vessel that could house the soul in the afterlife. But they were also working according to Ma'at's principles, following the proper procedures and speaking the correct spells, and performing every action with the precision and care that cosmic order demanded. If the mummification was done incorrectly, if shortcuts were taken or rituals were skipped or the process was corrupted through greed or carelessness, then the deceased would be vulnerable in the afterlife and might not be able to complete the journey to the Hall of Two Truths. The Book of the Dead spells that were buried with the deceased included invocations to both Anubis and Ma'at, prayers asking Anubis for protection and guidance, and prayers declaring the deceased's commitment to Ma'at and their confidence that they had lived according to her principles. Some spells even included magical formulae intended to prevent the heart from testifying against the deceased during the weighing ceremony, prayers that would keep the heart silent about any violations of Ma'at the person might have committed during life. These spells reveal a tension in Egyptian thought between the absolute justice that Ma'at represented and the very human desire to escape the consequences of moral failings. In temple rituals throughout Egypt, priests would make offerings to Ma'at, presenting her feather or her image to the gods as a symbol that the cosmic order was being maintained, that truth and justice still governed creation. Pharaohs in particular were expected to present Ma'at to the gods regularly, demonstrating that they were ruling according to her principles and maintaining the proper relationship between human society and divine order. When pharaohs failed in this duty, when they ruled unjustly or allowed corruption to flourish or violated Ma'at through their actions, the consequences could be catastrophic, not just for the king himself, but for all of Egypt. Anubis was invoked at these temple rituals as well, honoured as the protector who ensured that death remained a passage rather than an ending, that the proper procedures were followed to transform the dead into eternal spirits. His cult centres, particularly in Sinopolis where the jackal was sacred and dogs were mummified and buried with elaborate ritual, became places of pilgrimage for those seeking protection for themselves and their loved ones in death. People would bring offerings to Anubis's temples, would commission mummies of dogs and jackals to be buried in his sacred necropolis, would pray for his favour and guidance when their own deaths approached. The partnership between Anubis and Ma structured how every Egyptian thought about death and the afterlife and the possibility of eternal existence. It wasn't enough to be wealthy or powerful or connected to the royal family. It wasn't sufficient to have an elaborate tomb or expensive grave goods or complex funerary rituals. The only thing that ultimately mattered was whether your heart would balance with Ma'at's feather, whether you had lived according to truth and justice and cosmic order, whether you had aligned yourself with the principle that held creation together or had opposed it through your actions and choices. This made Egyptian ethics deeply serious and deeply personal. Every choice mattered because every choice would be weighed literally at death. Every action left a mark on the heart that would be measured against the feather of Ma'at. Every lie made the heart heavier. Every act of injustice added weight that would pull down the scales and result in annihilation. But every act of kindness and truth and justice made the heart lighter, brought it closer to balancing with the feather, increased the chances that death would be a transformation into eternal life rather than a descent into oblivion. When you understand this, when you grasp the full implications of Anubis and Ma'at's partnership in determining the fate of every soul, you begin to see why Egyptian civilization placed such emphasis on tomb construction and funerary preparation and ethical conduct. They weren't being morbid or death-obsessed. They were being realistic about the fact that death comes for everyone and that the only way to survive that death was to have lived according to Ma'at's principles, to have made choices that aligned with cosmic order, to have a heart that was light enough to balance with the feather of truth. Anubis standing beside the scales, Ma'at's feather resting on one pan, the deceased's heart on the other, Ammit waiting hungrily for hearts that failed the test, Thoth recording the results, Osiris presiding over the entire ceremony as Lord of the Dead. This scene represented the culmination of every Egyptian life, the moment when all the masks and pretenses and social roles fell away, and only the truth of the heart remained to be weighed against the truth of Ma'at herself. Now we must speak of three goddesses whose stories are bound together so intimately that separating them becomes nearly impossible, yet each possesses her own distinct character and her own essential role in maintaining the balance of creation. Hathor, Sekhmet, and Bastet represent different manifestations of divine feminine power, different aspects of the same fundamental principle expressed through different forms and different temperaments. They are three and yet one, separate deities and yet expressions of the same cosmic force, demonstrating the Egyptian comfort with paradox and their refusal to reduce complexity into simple categories of either-or. Hathor stands as perhaps the gentlest of all the major Egyptian deities, the goddess of love and beauty and music and dance and joy, the divine principle that celebrates what is pleasurable and beautiful in existence rather than merely dutiful or ordered. She was depicted as a woman with the horns of a cow with the sun disk nestled between them, or sometimes as a cow herself, that gentle creature that provided milk and nourishment to Egypt's people. Her name means House of Horus, and she was understood as the mother or sometimes the wife of Horus, depending on which tradition you encountered, her relationship to the falcon-headed god as complex and multi-layered as most divine relationships in Egyptian theology. But Hathor's gentleness masked tremendous power, and her role as a nurturing mother concealed her capacity for absolute destruction when the situation demanded it. She was the Eye of Ra, that extension of the sun god's power and will, and this meant she could be dispatched to punish those who violated cosmic order just as much as she could comfort those who sought her blessing. This duality was not a contradiction in Hathor's nature, but rather the fullness of her divinity, the complete expression of the feminine principle that contained within itself both creation and destruction, both nurturing and devastating power. There is a famous myth that illustrates this duality perfectly, a story that has been told in many versions and that reveals something profound about how power must sometimes be exercised, even when the exerciser of that power would prefer gentleness. Ra became furious with humanity one day, perhaps because mortals had forgotten him, or had failed to maintain Ma'at, or had become arrogant in their belief that they no longer needed divine guidance. The reasons varied depending on which version of the story was being told, but the consequence was always the same. Ra decided that humanity needed to be punished, that the world had become so corrupt that drastic action was necessary to preserve cosmic order. So Ra sent his daughter Hathor into the world to punish humanity, to become his instrument of divine vengeance, his eye that would burn away the corruption that threatened to overwhelm creation. But something happened to Hathor as she took on this destructive role, something that the myth describes with a kind of tragic inevitability. She transformed. Her gentle nature became fierce, and her nurturing qualities became twisted into something violent and consuming. She became Sekhmet, the fierce lioness, the goddess of plague and war and vengeance, the one whose hunger for destruction would consume everything in her path if she wasn't stopped. Sekhmet emerged as a being of pure wrath and devastating power, a lioness with a human body who wore the solar disk upon her head, proclaiming her connection to Ra's burning authority. She roamed through Egypt, slaughtering the wicked and the righteous indiscriminately, her bloodlust growing with each act of destruction, her fury feeding on itself until she had become almost a force of nature that even Ra couldn't control. The more she killed, the more she wanted to kill. The more blood spilled, the hungrier she became. She had transcended her original purpose of punishing wrongdoers and had become a plague that threatened to destroy all of Egypt and possibly all of creation itself. Ra realized that Sekhmet had gone too far, that his punishment had become too severe, that he needed to stop the destruction before there was nothing left to save. But how do you stop a goddess who has become unstoppable, a force that has grown too powerful to be commanded? How do you calm divine fury that has fed on blood and violence until it has transcended all reason and all restraint? This is where the wisdom of other gods became necessary, where Ra's power alone proved insufficient to solve the problem he had created through his own rage. Thoth, that god of wisdom and magic whose cleverness had solved so many cosmic crises, devised a solution that was as elegant as it was necessary. He ordered that barley be ground into flour and mixed with pomegranate juice and herbs and magical ingredients to create a substance that resembled blood. Vast quantities of this mixture were poured over the fields and the valleys of Egypt where Sekhmet roamed in her destructive rampage. The fierce lioness goddess, her mind clouded by bloodlust and battle frenzy, mistook the potion for blood and fell upon it, drinking deeply, consuming gallon after gallon of the mixture until she had drunk so much that she could no longer move. Sekhmet collapsed into sleep, her rage finally exhausted, her destructive impulse finally sated, her violent transformation finally halted by the clever stratagem of offering her what she craved. And when she awoke after 3 days of sleep, something remarkable happened. The fury had left her, the bloodlust had passed, the desperate hunger for destruction had been transmuted into something else entirely. Sekhmet looked around and saw Ptah, the god of creation and fertility, and she saw him not as an enemy to be destroyed, but as someone she could love, someone whose creative power balanced and complemented her destructive force. In some versions of the myth, she and Ptah united in a sacred marriage that symbolized the balance between creation and destruction, between the power to bring things into being and the power to unmake them. In other versions, Sekhmet simply transformed back into Hathor, the gentle goddess emerging once more from the fierce lioness, the nurturing principle reasserting itself after having been overwhelmed by the destructive aspect of divine power. In still other versions, Sekhmet didn't disappear, but instead became Bastet, the cat goddess, the middle ground between Hathor's complete gentleness and Sekhmet's overwhelming fury, a balance point where divine power could be fierce and protective without becoming uncontrollably destructive. This transformation from Hathor to Sekhmet to Bastet represents one of the most important theological insights of Egyptian religion, the understanding that the same divine force could manifest in different forms depending on what circumstances demanded, that the feminine principle in creation contained multitudes of expression, and that these expressions could seem contradictory only if you refused to accept their fundamental unity. Hathor and Sekhmet and Bastet were not 3 completely different goddesses. They were 3 expressions of the same goddess, 3 aspects of the same cosmic principle, 3 ways that divine feminine power manifested in response to different situations and different needs. Bastet emerged as a distinct goddess in her own right, especially as Egypt's history progressed and different regions emphasized different deities. In Lower Egypt particularly, Bastet became the dominant feline goddess, and her character evolved over time from a fierce warrior lioness into the cat goddess that people think of today. She retained the strength and the protective fury of her origins, but she expressed these qualities in gentler, more domestic forms. She was the goddess who protected homes and families, who guarded pregnant women and helped with childbirth, who watched over children and kept them safe from disease and from evil spirits that might threaten them in the night. Bastet was depicted as a woman with the head of a cat, and sometimes as a full cat, often holding a sistrum in one hand and an aegis in the other. The sistrum was a musical instrument, and music and dance were among Bastet's domains, connecting her to Hathor's love of celebration and joy. But the aegis, a symbol of protection and divine power, reminded everyone that Bastet could become fierce and deadly if those under her protection were threatened. She was the goddess of pleasure and protection combined, the principle that understood that life shouldn't be only duty and suffering, but could also include joy and beauty and celebration. The difference between Hathor and Bastet, subtle as it might seem, revealed important distinctions in how Egyptian theology understood divine power and its manifestations. Hathor was the cosmic mother, universal in her nurturing mother to gods and humans alike, representing the principle of motherhood and fertility in their most essential forms. She was depicted as a cow, that sacred animal that provided milk and sustenance to Egypt's cattle herds. She was the deity of abundance and sexuality and the pleasure that could be found in love and music and dance. Bastet, by contrast, was more particular and more domestic. She was the household goddess, the protector of home and family, the one invoked by ordinary people in their daily lives, rather than by pharaohs and priests in cosmic rituals. She was the fierce mother cat who would destroy anyone who threatened her kittens, but she was also the companion animal who lived alongside humans and made their homes safer and more pleasant. Cats in Egypt were sacred to Bastet, and injuring a cat was considered a terrible crime against the goddess and against the natural order of things. Sekhmet occupied a different position entirely, one that was both more terrifying and in some ways more essential than either Hathor or Bastet. She was the warrior goddess, the fierce destroyer, the one who stood at Ra's prow during the nightly journey through the underworld and fought against Apophis, the serpent of chaos. She was the plague that could be sent to punish those who violated Ma'at, the disease that spread when someone violated cosmic order too severely to be tolerated. She was the one invoked when protection needed to be fierce and absolute, rather than gentle and nurturing. Sekhmet was also a goddess of healing, paradoxically, because the same power that could cause plague and disease could also cure it. She was the patron of physicians and those who worked with medicine, because understanding disease and how to create it was essential to understanding how to cure it. Some of her priests and priestesses became doctors and healers, using their knowledge of poisons and medicines to help people who were sick or injured. The Egyptians understood that destruction and healing were two sides of the same coin, that the power to harm and the power to cure were sometimes one and the same force directed toward different purposes. The three goddesses together represented something that modern theology often struggles to express, the idea that divine power is not simple or unambiguous or always gentle or always fierce, but rather contains within itself the capacity for all expressions depending on what is needed. When love and nurturing and beauty were required, Hathor manifested. When protection and domestic care and celebration were needed, Bastet appeared. When fierce destruction and divine punishment and the elimination of threats to cosmic order were necessary, Sekhmet emerged. And the same goddess could be all three, could move between these manifestations fluidly, because they were not fundamentally different, but rather different facets of the same jewel. This flexibility and capacity for transformation that these three goddesses embodied revealed something profound about Egyptian cosmology and Egyptian thought. The Egyptians refused to reduce their deities to simple definitions or single characteristics. A god or goddess could be multiple things at once, could be gentle and fierce, nurturing and destructive, joyful and terrible, all according to what the situation demanded. The universe they inhabited was one where complexity and paradox were fundamental to how reality actually worked, where the same force could create and destroy, give life and take it away, all in the service of maintaining Ma'a and cosmic order. Hathor was worshipped throughout Egypt, but she had particular importance at Dendera, where a great temple was dedicated to her, a place where pilgrims came seeking her blessing for fertility and successful childbirth, and the joy that comes from love and music and celebration. People came to her temples with prayers, asking for happiness and protection, asking that she would bless their families and their children and their homes. Musicians and dancers were particularly devoted to Hathor because she was the patron of these arts, the goddess who understood that beauty and pleasure and artistic expression were not frivolous but were essential aspects of a fully human life. Bastet was worshipped particularly in the city of Bubastis in Lower Egypt, and her cult center there became one of the great religious centers of ancient Egypt. Pilgrims came from throughout the land to celebrate her festivals, which were occasions of tremendous joy and celebration, thousands of people gathering to dance and make music and honor the goddess who had become the beloved patron of ordinary homes and ordinary people. Bastet's festivals were among the most popular in Egypt, celebrated with more enthusiasm and larger crowds than many of the more important deities received, revealing how close Bastet had become to the hearts of the common people who felt that she understood their lives and protected the things that mattered most to them. Sekhmet was feared and respected and appeased through offerings and rituals, but she was not celebrated with the joy that Hathor and Bastet received. Her temples were places where one went to seek healing from disease or protection from danger, where priests worked with her terrible power to serve purposes of justice and protection. Sekhmet was the goddess you appeased to keep from being struck down, the one you honored to ensure that divine punishment would not fall upon you or your family. She was essential, absolutely necessary for maintaining cosmic order, but she was a necessity that inspired fear and awe rather than love and affection. Yet even Sekhmet had her gentle side, her capacity to heal and to protect those who worshipped her faithfully. There are prayers to Sekhmet asking her to turn away her destructive rage and instead use her power to protect and to heal. She was understood as the divine healer, the goddess whose vast knowledge of poisons and disease could be turned toward curing illness and preventing death. In this aspect she was sometimes called Sekhmet the healer, or she who is beneficial, acknowledging that her destructive power could serve protective and creative purposes when properly directed. The relationship between these three goddesses and the concept of the Eye of Ra was crucial to understanding how they functioned in Egyptian cosmology. The Eye of Ra was not a single fixed entity but rather a power or an extension of Ra himself that could manifest through different goddesses depending on what was needed. Sometimes the Eye of Ra was Hathor, sometimes it was Sekhmet, sometimes it was Bastet or even other goddesses like Wadjet or Mut. The Eye of Ra represented Ra's ability to see what was happening throughout creation, to observe whether Ma'at was being maintained or whether Isfet was growing, and to take action to correct imbalances when necessary. In this capacity as the Eye of Ra, Hathor and her sister manifestations served as Ra's agents in the world, his instruments for maintaining order and punishing those who violated it. But they were not mere passive tools. They possessed their own wills and their own personalities and their own desires, even as they served the larger purposes of cosmic order. This tension between serving Ra's purposes and having their own autonomous agency gave these goddesses great complexity and made them far more interesting than they would have been if they were simply servants of a male god's will. The triadic structure of Hathor, Sekhmet, Bastet also reflected something about how the Egyptians understood the divine feminine more generally. Women in their theology were not reduced to passive or secondary roles but were understood as possessing tremendous power and agency. The goddesses could be loving and nurturing, yes, but they could also be fierce and violent and absolutely uncompromising in their defense of order and justice. They could be seductive and beautiful and centered on pleasure and celebration, but they could also be warriors and healers and the source of both sickness and cure. This vision of divine feminine power influenced how Egyptian women understood themselves and their possibilities. While Egyptian society was patriarchal in structure and in many of its practices, the mythology provided examples of female deities who possessed authority and autonomy and who exercised tremendous power without needing to apologize for it or to diminish themselves to make male gods comfortable. Goddesses like Hathor and Sekhmet and Bastet and Isis and Nephthys were not secondary or derivative. They were fundamental to how creation worked, and their power was acknowledged and celebrated even when that power was sometimes terrifying. The three goddesses together also represented different stages of the feminine life cycle as understood in Egyptian thought. Hathor, as the cosmic mother, represented fertility and the capacity to create life and the abundance that came from that creation. Bastet represented the protective mother and the caretaker of family and home, the one who nurtured and protected what had been created. Sekhmet represented the fierce destroyer, perhaps the older woman, the one who had moved beyond fertility and nurturing and who now possessed the authority to judge and punish and eliminate threats. Together they encompassed the full range of feminine experience and power, from creation through nurturing, through the authority that came with age and experience. This cyclical understanding of how the goddesses related to each other and to time reflected the Egyptian understanding of time itself as cyclical rather than linear. Just as the sun died each night and was reborn each morning, just as the Nile flooded each year and then receded, just as the seasons cycled through their appointed sequences, so too the divine feminine passed through different expressions and different manifestations as circumstances changed and situations demanded different responses from the universe. When you think about Hathor, Sekhmet, and Bastet together, when you understand how they represented different but interconnected aspects of the same underlying divine principle, you begin to grasp something essential about Egyptian theology and about how they understood existence itself. Power and beauty and protection and destruction were not opposed to each other, but were different expressions of the same fundamental forces. The feminine principle in creation contained multitudes, contained gentle nurturing and fierce protection and overwhelming destruction all at once, ready to manifest in whichever form circumstances required. These three goddesses offered women throughout Egypt models of power that didn't require them to become less feminine or to deny beauty or pleasure or nurturing in order to be fierce and powerful. Hathor showed that you could be loving and beautiful and joyful while also being an instrument of divine will capable of terrible destruction. Sekhmet showed that you could be violent and fierce and absolutely uncompromising in pursuit of justice while also being capable of healing and care. Bastet showed that you could be protective and fierce while also being comfortable with the domestic and the everyday and the intimate. Together, they represented a vision of divine and human potential that refused to reduce women into single categories or force them to choose between different aspects of their nature. A woman could be all of them at different times, could be gentle when gentleness was appropriate and fierce when fierceness was called for, could nurture her family and protect her home, and also pursue justice and power and the things that mattered to her. The goddesses embodied this complexity and made it sacred, made it part of the cosmic order itself. We have journeyed together through an entire cosmos of divine beings, from the loneliness of Atum standing on his primordial mound, all the way to the fierce protection of the three goddesses who embody both nurturing and destruction. We have watched creation unfold through acts of desperate courage and ingenious magic, through sacrifice and transgression, and the endless struggle to maintain order against the ever-present threat of chaos. We have seen how the Egyptian gods were not distant and perfect and unchangeable, but rather profoundly connected to the human experience of love and loss, of ambition and betrayal, of the constant tension between what we must accept. What strikes me most powerfully about all these stories, when we consider them together as a unified vision of existence, is how the Egyptians understood creation not as a single event that happened long ago and then concluded, but as an ongoing process that required constant effort and constant presence and constant commitment from the gods themselves. The universe was not a machine that ran on its own once it had been wound up. It was alive. It was conscious. It demanded participation and sacrifice and attention every single moment, every single breath, every single second. This is why the Egyptians placed such tremendous emphasis on maintaining Ma'at through their daily actions and their rituals and their moral choices. They understood that they were not separate from the cosmos, but were participants in it, that their decisions and their conduct directly affected whether cosmic order would continue to prevail or whether chaos would begin to gain ground. When a person lived justly and spoke truthfully and acted according to Ma'at, they were literally helping to maintain creation itself. When someone violated these principles, they were adding weight to the Isfet that pressed constantly at the boundaries of order. Every funeral was a reenactment of creation. Every mummification was a repetition of the rituals that Isis and Nephthys first performed on Osiris's body. Every prayer to the gods was an invocation of those divine forces that had established cosmic order at the beginning of time and that continued to maintain it through their ongoing work. The past was not truly past. It was eternally present, eternally being renewed, eternally serving as the pattern and the template for how the present should be lived and understood. Atum created himself from nothing, and in his loneliness he created others. Through that initial act of desperate generative power, everything that followed became possible. Shu and Tefnut created Geb and Nut, who created Osiris and Isis, and Set and Nephthys, and Horus the Elder. These gods in turn shaped the world through their actions and their relationships and their struggles with each other and with the fundamental forces of existence. But they also shaped human society and human possibility because every pharaoh was understood as the living Horus, and every Egyptian was understood as descended from the gods themselves, carrying divine blood and divine potential within them. The pantheon we have explored tonight represents something far more profound than a collection of stories told for entertainment or religious instruction. These myths embody the deepest truths that the Egyptians discovered about how existence actually works. They understood that power without wisdom was tyranny, which is why Ra needed Thoth beside him. They understood that creation required both masculine and feminine principles working in concert, which is why Osiris and Isis together brought forth the heir who would challenge Set's chaos. They understood that transformation and death were not endings but passages, which is why Nut received both the sun and Osiris into her body each night and gave birth to them renewed each morning. The Egyptians lived surrounded by death in ways that we, in modern times, often try to avoid confronting. They saw death daily, saw the bodies of the dead being prepared for their journey into the afterlife, understood that every person they knew would eventually face the moment of judgment before Anubis and Ma'at. Yet instead of being paralyzed by this reality, they transformed it into something meaningful and even beautiful. They created a vision of existence in which death was not the final catastrophe, but rather the ultimate test of whether a life had been lived according to truth and justice. They made death into a gateway rather than a barrier, a passage into eternal life rather than an ending into oblivion. This is what made Egyptian mythology so powerful and so resilient. It addressed the most fundamental human anxieties and fears, and it offered not false comfort but rather a realistic framework for understanding existence. Yes, death comes for everyone. Yes, chaos is always present at the boundaries of order. Yes, injustice exists and sometimes the wicked triumph temporarily over the righteous. But none of this is final. None of this is irreversible. The sun rises each morning after dying in the night. The Nile floods each year after receding. The seasons cycle endlessly through their patterns. The gods themselves underwent death and transformation and renewal. Why should we expect anything different? When you walk through the world now, after journeying through these stories with me, try to see what the Egyptians saw. When the sun rises in the morning, understand it as Ra being reborn after his perilous journey through the underworld. When you feel a cool breeze on your face, remember that you're feeling Shu's presence, the god of air and separation who stands eternally between sky and earth, holding the heavens above through his tireless effort. When you look at a mother protecting her children, see in her the face of Isis and Nephthys and Hathor and Bastet and all the divine feminine principles that nurture and protect what is vulnerable. When you encounter injustice, remember Horus challenging Set for 80 years, refusing to accept that chaos should triumph, refusing to give up despite overwhelming odds. Most importantly, understand that your own choices matter cosmically. Your decisions about whether to live according to truth or deception, whether to act justly or unjustly, whether to help maintain Ma'at or whether to increase Isfet. All of this contributes to the ongoing struggle between order and chaos that defines existence itself. You are not separate from the cosmos. You are a participant in it. You are connected to Atum and Shu and Tefnut and Geb and Nut and all the gods and goddesses who have worked eternally to maintain creation. This is what I find most remarkable and most moving about Egyptian mythology. It is not a collection of escapist fantasies meant to distract from a harsh reality. It is a sophisticated philosophical and theological system designed to help humans understand their place in the cosmos and to help them live in a way that honors both their human needs and their cosmic responsibilities. The gods were powerful beyond measure, yes, but they were also subject to the same fundamental principles that governed reality. They had to eat and sleep. They had to make difficult choices. They had to accept losses and grieve and find ways to continue despite catastrophe. They had to work constantly to maintain order against the ever-present threat of chaos. And so must we, every day, every moment of our lives. This is the great gift that Egyptian mythology offers, not the promise that if we believe hard enough, everything will be perfect, but rather the understanding that we are part of something greater than ourselves, that our actions matter, that we have a role to play in maintaining the cosmic order that makes all existence possible. The Egyptians built one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known, not through luck or accident, but through understanding these principles and living according to them consistently for thousands of years. As the night deepens and you settle into sleep, as you prepare to make your own journey through the darkness into renewal and rebirth, I hope you carry these stories with you. I hope you remember Isis's devotion and her refusal to accept that death was final. I hope you remember Thoth's cleverness and his capacity to find solutions when direct power wasn't sufficient. I hope you remember Anubis's quiet dedication to his sacred duty and Ma'at's absolute commitment to truth and justice above all else. I hope you remember that you, like all the Egyptians before you, are connected to these eternal principles and to the ongoing struggle to maintain order in a cosmos that constantly threatens to slip back into chaos. The stories don't end here in the darkness where we've been sitting together. They continue endlessly, night after night, generation after generation, in the hearts and minds of those who understand that the gods are not distant memories but eternal presences, that creation is not finished but forever continuing, that we all have a role to play in maintaining the most sacred principle of all, Ma'at, truth, order, justice, the delicate balance that holds everything together. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the divine realm. Until we meet again in the darkness, in that sacred space where stories are told and dreams are born, where the boundaries between the living and the dead become thin and permeable, and transformation becomes possible.